Dear Sister, I hope this letter finds you well. The northern winter winds have not been kind to me here. The recruits are cold and hungry, but unfortunately I cannot say my many years of service make me any warmer or fuller. Those young souls who are foolish enough to voluntarily join me here in this white frozen hell are much more brave than I was when I had enlisted. And sister, unfortunately, it is with great displeasure I must inform you I will not be in contact for several months. Possibly even several years. The High Command are sending me farther north with a new team. Among our ranks will be 2 seasoned slaves. We are to begin a mining operation to help fund the war effort in any way possible. I am afraid my failed efforts in the south against the bootleggers have earned me this exile. I love you, dear sister, and I hope to speak with you again very soon. Sincerely, your brother, Hawthorne. Captain Hawthorne, his team, and the slaves all finally made their way to the northern mountains. The journey was long, and they are all extremely weary from the travel. Now the only thing left to do would be to find the mountains that the RimWorld Marshal Service have deemed acceptable for their mining operations. Finally, days later, as the snow began to thaw from the ground, on the 1st of April, 5543, we arrived. Naturally, Captain Hawthorne had the slaves begin digging out a nice spot for us to lay our weary heads, just as well everyone else began cutting down trees and deconstructing some local ruins, that way we could use the materials to try and begin building our mine. It was ever so kind of the overlords with the RimWorld Marshal Service to provide us with essentially nothing to come here and start a mine, that way we could fund their war effort, although I do suppose it is our war now as well, as we are the pawns in their game. No pun intended. But a big part of them not providing us with essentially any resources as well is the fact that we don't have any food. So we sent our slave, Happy Oak, as it were, to go out and collect some berries for everyone to enjoy. Captain Hawthorne also ordered the slave to build a fire inside tonight so we don't freeze to death. Then just before everyone laid down for the night, the captain wooed our soldier Konar into becoming his lover. The two of them have been traveling for a very long time together with the rest of the group, so it seems that this was long overdue. Now, it is worth mentioning, of course, that the RimWorld Marshal Service has rules against falling in love with your subordinates. But I suppose Captain Hawthorne and Konar just decided that, what's it gonna hurt? They'll never know that we're up here in the northern mountains playing hide the hot dog with each other, so I guess they just decide to fall right in love. Now, of course, these rules could be overlooked if the two of them do decide to get married, but that'll be up to them, and we'll have to see what happens in the future, of course. But the very next day, we began mining out a massive section of the mountain to begin clearing way for many rooms, such as a production room where we will be turning slate blocks into stones, that way we can use them for furniture and other things. Because as it stands right now, without any rooms, we're having to butcher our wild game outside like a bunch of savages, and then bring it inside to our lonely little campfire and begin cooking meals for everyone. Which, as you could imagine, is not very sanitary. Interestingly enough, while our slave Lurkat was digging out a production room, he managed to strike coal ore. Coal would be extremely valuable to us here because there's not many trees that grow, so it's the perfect substitute to wood for powering any steam generators or anything for electricity. Sometime later, our soldier Sandra began building a stone cutting bench, which was perfect. It's exactly what we needed to turn these chunks into blocks so we can finally begin making some furniture and other things. Now, a moment ago I mentioned steam-powered generators. Now that won't be possible without any components, so we had our slave Lurkat go and start digging at some compacted machinery. Later in the evening, Captain Hawthorne decided to take his men out on a hunting trip. Yes, wild snow hares and berries were sustaining them, for now, but this wouldn't last. We would need something much bigger, such as muffalo. Lucky enough for us, there just so happened to be a herd of muffalo tucked into the hollow between these two mountains. So, of course, our soldiers opened fire upon them. And it took a little while because there were many muffalo, but this would just mean that there'd be plenty of food after we slaughtered them all. After that was done, of course, we began hauling all of their corpses back home. However, later that night, while everyone was sleeping, we had a surprise raid from a bunch of Thrumboians. They were going to prepare for a while and then begin their attack on us. It was quite obvious by the size of the raid and the fact that they just had some simple archers and no elite death squad members or anything like that, that these Thrumboians had no idea that they were facing down an entire marshal service squad. Unfortunately for the Thrumboians, but luckily for us and our soldiers, this lack of information would cost them their lives. With their leader defeated and another member dead, the remaining two decided to try and flee back to their tribe to tell them what had happened here today. Unfortunately for them, though, we couldn't allow this to happen, and the damage was already done. Captain Hawthorne shot the injured leader in the head, and then began going about his day as per usual. With the threat no longer present, we could finally begin working on our steam-powered generator once again. This steam-powered generator would be perfect, and we would finally have some light inside this massive hole we've dug inside the mountain, which is great because now we can actually see where we're swinging our pickaxes. In the southern section of the mountain, we decided to begin digging out some massive hallways as well as some individual rooms for the soldiers, and at some point, of course, we'll get around to digging out a nice little room for our slaves, but they are going to be bottom of the bucket here because we are assholes. To kind of show how big of assholes we really were, the slaves were still sleeping in the production room next to all the rock rubble, and we decided to build the captain and Konar a beautiful little fur bed for them to lay on, which in comparison to where the slaves were sleeping was pretty awful. And by awful, I mean an awful thing to do. The bed is not awful. Look how comfortable Captain Hawthorne and Konar are. No, that bed, that is a nice bed, and very comfortable, I might say. But on the opposite side, in the production room, this is where our two slaves are sleeping. Very unfortunate, they're having to use pieces of slate as pillows, not very comfortable. Now, some time later, we had a weary traveler named Burl offer to join us. They stated they had nowhere else to go, and they were more than happy to enlist in the RimWorld Marshal Service. So we happily accepted, as we needed all the hands we could get realistically. Not only would we accept any help that we could get here by having someone enlist in the Marshal Service, but also just the RimWorld Marshal Service in general could use all the help it could get in the war that is currently going on against the bootleggers, Thrumboians, the settlers, basically just the rebels as a whole. A little bit of time later, we had Konar build us some wonderful food baskets out of slate, that way it's indoors, away from any animals or things like that. But then, out of the blue, our slave Lurkat decided to rebel against us. Two of our soldiers came in to stomp out his rebellious flame. And even Captain Hawthorne said that we could forgive this transgression, but we would not forget it. We would only forgive this simply because we needed him. As Lurkat lay there on the ground bleeding, Happy Oak tended to him and tried to explain to him that now would not be the moment for rebellion, but that time would soon come. Of course, though, Lurkat would not heed these words, unfortunately. Sometime later, though, Captain Hawthorne and Konar decided it was time to tie the knot. They were going to do things officially in the eyes of the RimWorld Marshal Service. Then shortly thereafter, I suppose inspired by the love story of the captain and Konar, Sev and Vern also decided that they were now in love and were going to be lovers, so that was great, I guess. Everybody's just falling in love here under the mountain. To celebrate the engagement between Captain Hawthorne and Konar, we decided to build them a wonderful slate bed which would actually be much more comfortable than laying on the dead muffalo carcass on the ground. We would then give that dead carcass to Sev and Vern now that they're lovers. And now we weren't slave drivers, I mean, we technically were, but not for our soldiers. We would allow them to have small little breaks like this where they could huddle around the fire and not freeze to death. It was also around this time that I remembered the golden rule of RimWorld. Never let your pawns eat without a table. There were so many close mental breaks, and I had forgotten this golden rule. So the next thing on our docket was building some steel chairs and a slate table. And it ended up turning out pretty great, but now we have these wonderful chairs and a very nice table and nothing to eat on it. Mega sloth steaks perhaps? Yes, Mega Sloth would go perfectly with a side of fried berries that we have out here in the wilderness, so we decided to hunt one, slaughter it, and, well, it ended up working out pretty easily, seeing how we had about 6 guns aimed at it. But now things weren't always Mega Sloth steaks and daisies. We ended up having another raid from the local Thrumboian tribe. This time they knew our presence here was much larger than they originally anticipated, so they sent a Thrumboian death squad with a chief. But of course Captain Hawthorne and our soldiers stood bravely in the face of this danger, for we had put down many Thrumboians before, several of them being Thrumboian death squads and a few of them also being chieftains. This was nothing that we couldn't handle. Our bullets flew through the Thrumboian death squad's pitiful insect armor like butter, like hot butter that just came out of a microwave. Our slave Happy Oak even managed to fend off one of the death squad members with his pickaxe. The Thrumboians, of course, were very loyal. One of them stood over their chieftain's body, firing their bow and arrow at us until they eventually died. Now, with the death squad eliminated and the threat was no longer, we could go back to working on our wonderful mining base. We began building a beautiful chandelier over our table. I think this would help with morale of our soldiers, seeing how this place is a frozen hellscape any other time. And staying on the topic of a frozen hellscape, winter is up and coming, so it's a great thing that we finally got some rice crops in. We can begin storing this for the harsh winter ahead. Speaking of which, it is also worth mentioning we should have someone coming from the overall Marshal Service pretty soon to collect some type of resource or tax from us. It was expected by this point that we would have something to provide the government with, so we need to try and prepare for that as well. But I do believe that the gold our slave just found inside the hill would be perfect to pay off the tax to the government. And we finally acquired the resources to build an electric stove, which was perfect because up until this point we have been cooking on the campfire. A little bit of time later though, in the late evening, we ended up getting word that Sev was pregnant. Captain Hawthorne was none too happy about this. We would have to hide this from the RimWorld Marshal Service because having a child out of wedlock is awful for the RimWorld Marshal Service, and just as well Captain Hawthorne could get in some deep shit for allowing this to happen under his watch. The two of them gathered in the dining hall to discuss their options on what to do. In the meantime though, we would continue our tireless work of building some beautiful floors in the rooms of our soldiers as well as through the hallways and whatnot, and also we would begin working on a new storage room just to the east of the hallway. Why did I say the word east instead of right? Well, I was just trying to be fancy. And then, fancy enough, see what I did there, we ended up having a private from the RimWorld Marshal Service government come to collect our taxes. Now, of course, as previously mentioned, we're going to fork over the gold that we found under the mountain. I do want to mention, though, that this tax is not a monetary tax. I keep calling it that. But realistically, it's the resource tax that the government basically sent us here for. So these privates and whatnot that are coming to collect it, the size of the caravans are going to get much larger and things like that. The reason this time that there's only one private coming to collect our resources is simply because the government didn't provide us with anything to use here when setting up the mining encampment. Thus, of course, they are well aware that we're going to be using most of the stone blocks and things like that in the beginning to go about setting up our actual mining encampment under the hill. But with that being said, that does mean at some point, instead of just providing them with gold and things like that, we're going to have to begin giving over our resources like slate and steel and things like that. We may even get to the point at some point where we're making enough product to sell to local settlements here, and we could actually give the silver to the government as well. But with that being said, it'll be a while before we get to that point. We're still trying to build some simple light bulbs and other things for quality of life under the hill. Just as well, something we began building that was long overdue was some defenses. We started with some marble barricades and some plain leather sandbags. Of course, it's nothing too fancy, but eventually I would like to get to the point where we could possibly build some machine guns or something like that. Of course, no automated turrets or anything like that, as during this day and age, things like that haven't been invented yet. So if you're a dear viewer who is worried that we're going to build a massive kill box or have automated turrets, fret not, my friends. However, with that being said, don't think that I am above littering this entire place with plenty of barbed wire to ensure that we are safe, which is exactly what we did. Now, unfortunately, late one evening, our slave Lurkat once again decided that he would attempt to rebel against us. This time we disregarded the chance that we could kill him, because that was a secondary thought. Of course, he did not die, but I can tell you that Captain Hawthorne is becoming quite tired of these advances by him. Sometime later, after Lurkat's pitiful rebellion, we ended up having some travelers who were requesting herbal medicine to save their friend's life after an attack. This was obviously complete bullshit, and we would not stand for it. And as if this fabricated story wasn't bad enough, the interruption came during Hawthorne's very own wedding. No, this would not stand. Hawthorne came up with the idea that he would make an example out of these filthy, lying beggars. This way maybe Lurkat would understand what it meant to cross him. Unfortunately, the RimWorld martial soldiers gathered around the beggars, including one child, and began opening fire upon them. Even the poor child was not safe from the wrath of Captain Hawthorne and the RimWorld Marshal Service. And I know what you're thinking, this is a horrible, awful thing, and I understand that, and I completely agree with you. I hope you understand that I am simply the narrator, and that these soldiers do as the Marshal Service instructs them to do. This, of course, was not given by the higher government, but by Captain Hawthorne. I can assure you, though, that this happens very regularly with the Marshal Service in general. The RimWorld Marshal Service is willing to do anything, whatever it takes, even if it's something as simple as getting a point across. Instead of beating Lurkat, as they had done many times, this would get the point across, seeing innocent people killed, an innocent child, for his wrongdoings, or what they explained as being his wrongdoings. Lurkat was ordered to carry the child to the body pile, but he could not bear to do it, so Happy Oak, of course, offered himself up to protect young Lurkat from this traumatizing event. As Happy Oak stood next to the child's body, he monologued to himself about how he will make the RimWorld Marshal Service pay for this. In the meantime, of course, we would continue mining out sections of the mountain. We would also begin working on a very small medical room for all the soldiers as well as our slaves. That way, in case anyone is injured in an upcoming raid and things like that, of course, they would be able to have a nice place to rest and heal. Hello and welcome back, my beloved friends, to the RimWorld Mining Empire, where at the moment we have many of our subordinates smoothing the walls of our beautiful little mining base inside the hill to make the place much more beautiful and interesting, much more pleasing to the eye, if you will. But let us waste no more time observing these frivolous little things. Let us begin. Now, one of the very first things we'll be working on today is a wonderful research table for Captain Hawthorne himself to, well, research at. One of the shining cornerstones of the Marshal Service is our research and our gifts of technology. The very first thing we decided to have Captain Hawthorne research was carpet making. I know it seems a bit silly, but the reason behind that is with carpet making we can actually make our flags. Now I hear you say, Rat Knight, how stupid that the RimWorld Marshal Service didn't provide your team with any flags before they set out on their expedition to set up this mining camp in the northern mountains. Now I hear that's a very valid concern. However, the reason behind this was so that we could kind of stay incognito, if you will. That way rebels and bandits wouldn't attack us. Or at the very least they would be less likely to attack us. Now Hawthorne thought it was the perfect time though, as we have a permanent setup inside the mountain and it would be great for boosting morale. Everyone united under the one red and black flag, except for the slaves, of course. And speaking of our slave subordinates, Hawthorne ordered some of our soldiers, along with the slaves, to go to the southern part of the mountain and continue mining it out. Now, he did commission to actually mine out a prison as well. That way, once we start taking prisoners, instead of just executing people that come near us, we would have a safe place to store them. And this prison would be perfect as well, because since we were inside of a mountain, the rock walls already provide enough of a prison, just being how tough that they are. So all we really had to do was to dig it out and throw some doors up. And with the current design and size of this prison, we could fit up to 8 prisoners, 2 prisoners to a room. Of course, if we have any overflow, though, we could throw them out in the foyer. And of course, making a beautiful and sustainable prison was important to us, but just as important was our soldiers' needs, so we were working on some beautiful floors for their gorgeous rooms as well. And just as Hawthorne was worried that he wouldn't have any bodies to fill up his prison, we ended up receiving a raid from the Red Cove Bandits. Now, you may previously know them as the Red Cove Settlement. Yes, this is a splinter faction from the settlement of the Alcohol Empire. Just as well, you may recognize the man leading the charge. Ah, yes, our dear old Ninjak is truly a prominent figure in the rebellion against the Marshal Service in this day and age. In the dead of night, he led his rebels against our mining encampment. However, Captain Hawthorne was well and ready for this fight. He advised the others to prepare, and we all headed outside. Well into the fight, I believe Ninjak realized his mistake that the Thrumboian raiders had made before him. They were outmatched and outgunned. They had underestimated just how powerful this very small settlement was. The RimWorld Marshal Service is no longer a bunch of ragtag officers with these dirty and piss-poor service pistols. No, we are a powerhouse. Even a small settlement like this could easily defeat someone like Ninjak's small raid, and I believe he did learn that here today as he retreated. He would almost definitely be back with more numbers and more experienced fighters. But this crime against the RimWorld Marshal Service could not go unpunished, and if we couldn't punish Ninjak directly, we would have to settle for the next best thing. We would have to torture and execute one of his men, the only surviving member of the raid. As you could see, this person had an unwavering loyalty to him. Ninjak is no doubt nearby, trying to think of his next move. Maybe he should try to move in alone. So if he doesn't see what we're doing to his soldier, he will almost definitely hear as the soldier cries out in agony, begging for help, begging to die. The torturous execution was spectacular, so spectacular in fact that Sev was now going into labor. Yes, the excitement seemed to cause her to, well, go into labor. It was time for her baby to be born. Happy Oak was kind enough to carry her all the way inside to the newly built medical bay that we had under the mountain, which was freshly cleaned and just ripe for delivering babies in. I'm not gonna lie to you though, it took a very long time for this baby to be born, but we were excited once it finally happened, of course. Happy Oak and Vern had the biggest smiles on their face, even with Happy Oak being an enslaved prisoner of an authoritarian government. Never mind, there's a baby giggling, how exciting. Vern and Sev ended up naming their baby Severn, naturally, as it's a mixture of the two names, and we thought it was a perfect fit, really. Now, with having a baby out of wedlock in the RimWorld Marshal Service being an offense punishable by death, Captain Hawthorne recommended to the couple maybe they should do things by the books, on paper. We'll put down that they got married just before the baby was even conceived, that sort of thing, and we won't look into it any further. So the couple, of course, happily obliged, seeing how it was their and their baby's life on the line. The two of them, of course, were indebted to Captain Hawthorne, which goes to show he's not doing this out of the kindness of his heart. He's doing this for political gain, essentially, for their loyalty and whatnot. He's not earning it, he's buying it. But, of course, buying someone's loyalty is not the same as earning it. He is simply blackmailing them in a way, shape, or form. Nonetheless, though, in the meantime, we ended up having a trade caravan come by, and they had plenty of cloth for us, which was perfect because we hadn't grown any cotton. We would be able to use this for many things, the most of which we would use on flags. So, of course, as you could imagine, the very first thing that Captain Hawthorne commissioned to be built out of it was a big, beautiful red and black flag right in front of the base. That way, everyone that comes by knows exactly who they're dealing with and where they are. Now, of course, this would defeat the the purpose of being a small incognito mining colony, but that's not what we're building. We're building a mining empire that is going to fuel the war machine that is the RimWorld Marshal Service. Now, of course, with that being said, though, we would not be able to build any type of empire if our soldiers were bored out of their minds. So Captain Hawthorne actually commissioned a small part of the mountain be turned into a recreation room, which would be perfect for keeping everyone entertained, essentially, so that they don't get bored and basically don't go insane because they're always stuck under this mountain. And you know what? If I were stuck under a mountain with the same 5 people every single day of my life, you know what would make me feel a little bit better? Playing some pool and maybe a little bit of blackjack or something like that with these same 5 people every single day. But nonetheless, it would make me slightly happier. Captain Hawthorne also allowed the slaves to use the recreation room. It would really help take away from the fact that, well, they're enslaved and occasionally get beaten. But a bit of pool will take their minds off of those bruises and scars. In the meantime, we decided to build a wooden windmill to generate a little bit of power. Since we're building the base so large, we're going to need more electricity to power all of our lamps and whatnot. But we weren't only just building some sweet-ass wooden windmills, we were also building a PM-1910 heavy machine gun turret. And you better believe that if Ninjak or any of those other filthy rebel scum decide to rear their ugly heads, that this bad boy will put them on the run. But building these wonderful weapons of destruction are, all well and good, but this colony is not going to function. This empire is not going to continue rolling without fuel. So we've been digging out quite a bit of coal to keep our steam-powered generator fueled. Eventually, I would like to move over to renewable resources, but for now, coal power is the way to go. Now, a little bit of time later, we received a letter from a commander with a local RimWorld Marshal Service platoon who actually said they were having issues out of a robber camp of Thrumboians nearby, and they asked us if we could help them take care of it. In exchange, they would actually send us a prisoner that they were attempting to recruit as payment, if you will. They would join us. And naturally, of course, eager to have more hands on deck, Captain Hawthorne accepted, and we sent out 4 people to begin attacking the robbers. Captain Hawthorne himself was actually among those who went out on the raid. Now, not only were we eager to accept this because the commander told us what to do as they were the commander and outranked Captain Hawthorne, but we were also hoping to get some good favor with the traders in the area. Maybe they would reward us with something or even be willing to discount prices. Now this journey was long and treacherous and extremely cold, with the frozen ground and the snowy, icy walk all the way to the bandit camp. Our newest recruit, Betrayal, was actually experiencing hypothermia. And kindly enough, Captain Hawthorne actually took off his warm uniform to give to her, that way she would not freeze to death. And though of course once again Captain Hawthorne's motives were always selfish, even saving a soldier, he's only doing it for himself and to better himself. Obviously, of course, this act of selflessness, or what they perceived as selflessness, earned him the respect of his soldiers. Perfect timing as well, I might add, because this bond formed between them all just before the battle with the Thrumboian robbers. Unfortunately for the Thrumboian robbers, they were very disorganized, as they're not really a rebel group, they're just filthy bandits essentially. So when the battle did finally begin, they all attacked us individually with primitive weapons compared to what our martial soldiers had, so I'll let you use your own common sense to determine how that worked out for them. It's not good. Nope, that is correct. We slaughtered every single one of them and then began ransacking their little base. Back at home, of course, the RimWorld Marshal Service commander held good on their promise, and they ended up sending Beyonder to us. Beyonder was not very good at most things, but Beyonder could sure as shit cook. So that was perfect because we needed a good cook under the mountain. Can you shoot a gun? Great. Can you not shoot a gun? Not so great, but if you can't shoot a gun and you can make a mean buffalo steak, well, that was also acceptable. With the others gone, Sev realized it was getting very chilly under the mountain with winter almost upon us. She ordered Happy Oak to begin building some electric heaters around the place, that way it's still nice, warm, and cozy. It took a while, but our soldiers finally made it home without any issues. The issues came after they returned home. Remember those robber Thrumboians? Turns out that they're a smaller part of a much larger faction of Thrumboians, and those Thrumboians have now come to try and attack us. But oh, how I wish that I could lie and say that our soldiers were afraid. Unfortunately for these Thrumboians, they were well outmatched. All they had to combat us with were simple sticks and stones, these pitiful little pilas and bow and arrow. It was nothing compared to the might of our forces. Our machine guns rained down hellfire upon them until eventually some of them began fleeing, and those that didn't were stomped out. Among them was a thrumboian by the name of Noprix, who could tend to our fields in the spring and summer, so we decided that we would capture them and enslave them. And though Noprix may not have thought this at the time, but they were truly one of the lucky ones, as all of their friends out in the fields were dead, and Captain Hawthorne and the other soldiers could be much more cruel than allowing them to stay here and work. I mean, I know I'm making it sound as if it's a real favor. They're obviously not letting them stay here to work. They're enslaved, but they could have killed them or tortured them. Speaking of killing and torturing, remember those traders that were having issues out of the Thrumboian robbers who were robbing them, killing them, torturing them, etc., etc.? Well, they have now come to the base, and it looks like they have a gift for us. They actually provided us with 2 winter coats for our 2 new recruits. We didn't ask how they got them, we were simply grateful, but these were 2 standard issue Marshal Service coats. They may be smugglers or something of that sort, but Captain Hawthorne could be inclined to turn a blind eye for discounted prices or more gifts in the future. But only time will tell how our relationship with the traders and the local settlement faction nearby will pan out. Will we kill them and enslave the rest of them, or will we all be best friends and they'll serve the marshals? It's hard to say, but we'll see in due time. As for now, we have expansion to worry about. We began commissioning more sections of the Great Mountain to be mined out so that we could build more rooms for more soldiers and slaves and things of that sort. This would, however, be briefly interrupted by the notification of a volcanic winter. It would seem that ash was pouring from the sky. This could only mean one thing. A volcano nearby has erupted, and it is going to fill the sky with ash we won't be able to see for quite some time until it clears out. Not that we really give a shit, we stay under a mountain all the time anyways. And speaking of our beautiful mountain base, Captain Hawthorne ordered the men and the slaves to dig out a large area for an armory. We have a lot of weapons piling up, yet we don't really have anywhere to keep them. During this time though, we also received information that Konar is pregnant with Captain Hawthorne's child. Oh, glorious days. The pair of them were extremely excited, and the soldiers excited for them as well. Hawthorne, of course, was extremely excited to notify his sister, in particular, of the blessing. However, a little bit of bad news, we have another raid. It would appear that the rebel leader Ninjak has returned with a band of warriors. These warriors, including Ninjak, are covered in black as to blend in with the volcanic ash falling from the sky, as well as the dark of night. The only other clothing items that they have are colored in white to blend in with the snow. A very crafty and clever move on the part of Ninjak. Their apparel would make them blend in with the surroundings and make them much harder for our soldiers to hit with their firearms. However, it is yet to be determined how effective these tactics would truly be against us. The only way to tell for sure is to battle. And I can tell you throughout this battle, their apparel gave them somewhat of an advantage, but our soldiers were highly skilled and highly trained. Captain Hawthorne actually ordered a band of soldiers to march towards the enemy away from their defenses. This would seem silly at first, but it gave us a much better vantage point and better view of the enemies, and thus winning us the battle. Ninjak attempted to retreat with his remaining men, but Captain Hawthorne chased after him, firing at him with his rifle. After shooting him in his back, Ninjak finally hit the snowy ground, and Captain Hawthorne quickly followed up to capture him. And it was at this point that Captain Hawthorne realized Ninjak was one of the bootleggers back in the days of the Alcohol Empire who defeated him at Silverhorn Mountain. To say that he was enraged by this information would be an understatement. Captain Hawthorne returned to the prison late that night. He brought Sev and he brought Vern with him to guard the doors. After quickly entering the prison, Sev and Vern, the two of them together, locked the door behind them to ensure no one would enter, just as Captain Hawthorne slowly approached the cells. Hawthorne stripped Ninjak of every single piece of his clothing just before he began stabbing him to death in front of his loyal soldier. And just like that, Ninjak had bled to death lying there with multiple stab wounds from the captain's bowie knife in that dark, cold prison cell. and his loyal rebel soldier lying there next to him witnessed every single second of it. The captain ordered Lurkot to carry Ninjak's body all the way outside to the pile where the other bodies lie. Lurkot was totally oblivious, as was Happy Oak, as to the connection that they would share to Ninjak, to Tree, and to Bacchus. Back at the prison, though, the loyal rebel soldier, Captain Hawthorne, had some very devious and cruel plans in mind for him. He said that he may go back, they would release him, and he may tell everyone what he saw here today, but without his tongue. And unfortunately, with as ruthless, devious, and horrible as Captain Hawthorne was, he was a man of his word. He removed the soldier's tongue, and then ordered Konar to release him, to which she did. But even with the soldier and with Ninjak both silenced, Ninjak's bodies still lie out there with a story to tell. So Captain Hawthorne ordered Vern to go out with the Molotovs and burn the corpses, including Ninjak. And of course Vern, loyal to Captain Hawthorne, was more than happy to oblige. He started the largest corpse fire that started a massive burning light in the snow. The smoke could be seen from miles away, and that smell was unmistakable. The rebels would surely know what happened to their leader. Hello my dear friends, and welcome back to our RimWorld mining empire. I must say I have quite the episode in store for you today, so I hope you are all extremely excited, I hope you're ready, and most importantly, I hope that you enjoy. But without further ado, let us begin. Alright, so we're starting this episode off with some pretty shocking news. It turns out our new soldier Beyonder has fallen in love with our slave Noprix, which is a massive no-no. As you could imagine, falling in love with your subordinates is an awful thing to do within the martial service. Falling in love with slaves is a crime punishable by death. And to make matters worse, instead of keeping it to himself, he has decided to also tell Sev about this information, which unfortunately would be an awful mistake for him. Because later that night, Sev approached Captain Hawthorne in his room to inform him of what's going on. During this time, Noprix thought it would be a wonderful idea to try and visit her new lover in his bedroom. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to her, this would be the beginning of the end. After tiptoeing her way through the hallway into Beyonder's room after she entered, she was then quickly surrounded by Captain Hawthorne and 3 other soldiers, all brandishing their weapons. The captain arrested her and then took her outside into the freezing cold of night. Noprix attempted to plead with the captain and the other soldiers for her life, but unfortunately, this crime was punishable by death, and there was a blood debt to be paid. The soldiers opened fire on Noprix, hitting her several times and then knocking her to the ground in the freezing snow. As she lay there in her own blood, screams of anguish and agony filled the night, until with one bullet, the captain silenced her screams, and she was gone. With this awful deed committed, there was but one thing left to consider: what would be done with Beyonder. Now, Captain Hawthorne had a wonderful idea of enslaving Beyonder. That way he could take Noprix's place, and we wouldn't lose the only good cook that we had. Somebody has to fuel this colony through meals, and unfortunately, as of now, it is Beyonder, regardless of his heinous crimes. But not only would the punishment end by being enslaved, we would also force him to carry his lover's corpse to the pile, which honestly was just a horrible, despicable punishment that was inflicted upon him. Hawthorne may have earned the respect from his close-knit circle of soldiers, but he is truly making enemies out of the slaves. Only time will tell, though, how this will pan out for him. Now, in the meantime, he has commissioned the slaves and some of the soldiers to build a much larger room for him and his growing family. And not only would this be a much larger and more comfortable room for him, his wife, and their baby-to-be, but this would also serve as a much nicer, more spacious study for his continued research into advanced technologies. And speaking of which, Captain Hawthorne is currently working on a project that involves the study of aeronautics, the study of flight. Now in the meantime, while the captain is studying, the slaves and the soldiers have been ordered to go out to a very small mountain near the base and begin a strip mining operation for resources. Now the mountain was mostly composed of sandstone, not very good for defenses, but it would be perfect for furniture and things like that inside the base. Just as well, before too long, we should end up having another resource tax collector from the Marshal Service. Now, in the meantime though, spring here in the northern mountains is extremely cold, and we didn't really get to grow enough crops for that, so we're going to need to try and substitute some of the crops with meat. So we began doing a bit of hunting. One of the largest animals that we could find was a polar bear. Now, of course, all 6 of us very easily dispatched of the polar bear, and then we began hauling its corpse all the way back home to cut it open and begin frying it up on our electric stove. Now, normally the heads of the animals that we kill we will also turn into food, but in this particular situation we decided to mount the polar bear's head on a plank. It looks nice and pretty, and we planned on giving it to Captain Hawthorne for his baby's crib. If I were a baby and I looked up and saw that shit hanging over my head, I'd feel pretty damn safe, I'm not gonna lie. Now some time later we ended up having a raid of thrumboians. Now I know what you're thinking, oh thrumboians, we've seen this 1,000 times, let's just kick their ass and get it over with. Wrong. These are not normal thrumboians, you see. We were very perplexed by them, as there was a thrumboian houndmaster with several armored huskies among them. Just as well, there was a chieftain among them as well. But he and the other thrumboians were not in their usual death squad attire or just normal thrumboian tribal attire. They were actually wearing armor. And just as well, one of them appeared to have a flaming bow and arrow. It would seem that the thrumboians are finally beginning to advance out of their tribal technology. And this advanced weaponry and armor is something that they're concocting on their own. It's not something that they've stolen or won in battle. But speaking of battles, as they began trotting towards us, of course we began opening fire on them. They were a very chaotic and malicious force of raiders. Their flaming bow and arrow caused a lot of fires around the battleground, which also in turn caused a lot of chaos. Just as well, their huskies were everywhere and seeming to be endless, and they were just unstoppable with their armor. Luckily though, we ended up being able to take them down with 0 casualties, though many of our people were injured. They also managed to destroy our brand new mounted machine gun that we built last episode. This truly shows the power the thrumboians are building up, I believe. Soon they will no longer be this technological backwater of thrumboians. They will be a force to be reckoned with. Truly they are already. Now maybe they're advancing in technology, but they're still filthy, dirty thrumboians. To show how dirty they are, one of their filthy dogs had scratched Captain Hawthorne on the leg and had become a festering infection. No doubt due to some type of husky or even thrumboian fecal matter. I'm sure it stepped in, the filthy animals. Those damn dirty dogs. Well, luckily though, not too long after, thanks to some good medical care and some good medicine, he did develop an immunity. Now, as mentioned previously, we've been doing quite a bit of hunting to try and sustain ourselves until the ground thaws out so we can begin growing rice and other crops once again. Now, the only issue with that, there is a scarcity of wildlife, so to survive, we're going to have to do a bit of trading with the local settlers in the area. We should, of course, let this serve as a lesson for this coming summer that we need to grow more and more crops. That way we don't have to rely on trade to try and feed our soldiers and slaves. Hawthorne and the others were simply not used to the cold of the northern mountains. There's a very short time that we can actually grow crops. Just after the caravan returned, we had realized they had bought plenty of cabbage for us all to eat, and it also looks like they had bought some cloth for us to use in some projects that the captain had in mind. Now, the first of these projects that Captain Hawthorne had in mind, you know, the slaves Happy Oak and Lurcott are very good at mining, but in the dark under the hill, it's very hard to see what you're actually mining. So he had the crafty idea to create some mining helmets for them. So he ordered Happy Oak to be the first to strap this piece of shit with a light on it onto his head and get to work. Happy Oak, of course, had to eat first, so he done that, but after he was done scarfing down some wonderful food, he actually went outside to begin mining some silver. Now, I know we called it a piece of shit a moment ago, but I only said that because Hawthorne made it. The mining helmets are actually really cool, and I really love them for the feel of this series and everything. I think they are perfect. But you know what else was perfect? The fact that Captain Hawthorne ordered Sandra to go outside, use up as many resources as it took to build 3 brand new mounted machine gun turrets. The next time those Thrumboians or any filthy rebel scum show their faces, these turrets will mow them down. Now, Konar did end up going into labor, and we all scurried about to try and get prepared for that. It would appear once again it was time for our good friend and slave, Happy Oak, to deliver another child for the Empire of the Marshal Service. Thankfully as well, he had his awesome looking headlamp, that way he could see all the parts lit up very nicely to deliver the child. Unfortunately, though, the child was delivered and it was quite sickly, but that was okay as Happy Oak would use some medicine to help nurse the child back to health. Now, we did have a wonderful suggestion by our good friend Nubian Beauty, who stated that we should name the children after precious stones and minerals. Now, as you can see, we kind of discussed this a little bit, and we kind of went more on the side of minerals instead of precious stones, so we have decided to name the child Slate. Now, why slate instead of any other type of mineral? Well, this mountain is mostly composed of slate, thus, of course, I felt it a fitting name. Now, just shortly after the birth of his beautiful baby girl, Captain Hawthorne managed to finish his research into flight. And now, along with that, he has discovered a new way of flight. Now, the Marshal Service has previously came up with airplanes and whatnot, but Hawthorne has discovered something he is calling helicopters. Now, helicopters, even in this universe, are not a new idea, but by this time they've been nothing but a concept. There's never actually been a perfected prototype that functions. So Hawthorne is going to attempt with the soldiers to build a bit of a prototype scout helicopter. Now, if this helicopter design that the captain has come up with is a success, it will be a major shifting point for the Marshal Service in the war as well as day-to-day operations. The maneuverability of this helicopter versus that of the planes that the Marshal Service uses is just uncomparable. Now, we couldn't have this bangin'-ass helicopter without a nice landing pad and some roads to walk around it, so we were working on that for a little while. Not too long after that, though, we had some traders stop in. Now, these traders, of course, had many wonderful items, as they often do, and they were willing to buy plenty of leathers and whatnot from us. So, in exchange, we bought some food from them, and just as well, we also bought some fuel that we would attempt to use in our helicopter. And then, as if on cue, we had our resource tax collectors from the Marshal Service who arrived, and we prepared to bring them plenty of steel. Just as well, Hawthorne also provided them with some information about the newly acquired helicopter. They also let us know how the war effort was going. Unfortunately, it looked like one of the ironclad ships just off the coast was recently raided by rebels and destroyed. The rebels also took all the weapons and resources that the ironclad was carrying with it, unfortunately. Alas, we cannot win every single battle, but we can still win the war. Now, Severn was old enough to walk around, and he decided the first thing he would do would be to eat a raw duck egg at the table. Jesus Christ, what a sick little freak. He'll fit in perfectly here with the rest of us sociopath, fascist, dictator-like bastards. And just like my dear old dad used to say, if you're old enough to walk, you're old enough to carry a gun. I'm just kidding. I didn't know him. Now, some time later, Captain Hawthorne decided it was finally time to take the helicopter out on its maiden voyage. There was a rebel hunting site nearby, and just like we've been talking about before, we are in desperate need of food, and we're tired of having to trade and pay for it. So why not kill our enemies and get food? 2 birds with 1 stone. The captain and Sandra flew over the small lake between us and the other mountains just before arriving at the hunting site. Now, it would appear that there were 4 hunters at this small hunting work site, but there were only 2 of us, the captain and Sandra. Luckily, though, they had the keen idea to bring a mounted machine gun along with them. We used our mounted machine gun to calmly explain to the rebels that we simply wanted food, not their life. Oh, I'm just kidding. We tore them to pieces. There were literally bits of them everywhere. It was disgusting. But now, with all the rebels dead, it would take a little bit of time because we had to have Sandra cut up all the mega sloth into meat so we could pack it all into the helicopter, along with all the heavy fur that would be much needed back home at base. And of course, after arriving back home, it would take a while to get it all brought inside. We also had Happy Oak work on some refrigerators, which were pretty good in the spring and summer for keeping things cold, but unfortunately you could only have one stack of meat in there at a time, but they were somewhat useful. But with all that being said, I think we can officially call Hawthorne's scout helicopter a massive success. It was perfect. Some time had passed later, and we had received a fair-sized raid of fairly well-equipped rebel soldiers from the Red Cove Bandits. This raid was personal, though. These rebels were here to seek revenge for their fallen leader Ninjak, no doubt. Among the rebels, though, we, the audience, no doubt spot some familiar faces once again. Yes, that is right, we have Shortus, the husband to the leader of the bootleggers' tree. He has also brought his son-in-law, Chet. Now, for those of you who have not watched the previous series, Chet was the lover of Lucky, who was also Shortus's daughter, who was killed by the Marshal Service, so no doubt that this battle will be very, very personal for both of them. Chet led the Demolition Men rebel towards us, but luckily we were able to easily dispatch of them. They were not planning on our mounted machine gun turrets, which destroyed the brunt of their attack. For the last time that they were here, there was simply one, but now we had three. With the raid defeated, Shortus and the remaining rebels attempted to flee our pursuing soldiers. Captain Hawthorne, pursuing Shortus, managed to shoot him in his one good leg, downing him, which was perfect because he was much more valuable to us alive than he was dead. You see, Hawthorne, being the greedy piece of shit that he is, he decided that he would keep Shortus alive so he could present him to the overall Marshal Service. That way he would gain fame and reputation, even a promotion of sorts. Even though they managed to botch keeping Chet alive, he was turned into Swiss cheese on the ground, Shortus would earn Hawthorne this reputation that he so desperately wished to mend. Because if you remember in the letter he wrote to his sister in episode 1, he was explaining that due to multiple failures throughout the war, he has been exiled here to the north to set up the mining operation, of course. The other soldiers begged Hawthorne to kill him, but he refused, of course, for his own personal reasons, because they have all heard of how dangerous Shortus was. Everyone except for the slaves, of course, who have been kept in the dark the entire time. The slaves knew very little about the war and who was actually winning, of course, but they did know how dangerous Shortus was based on his actions on the battlefield. So everyone was extremely shocked when Captain Hawthorne enslaved Shortus to present him to the Marshal Service, as the next tax collection would not be coming around for another year or so. It wouldn't matter, however, because Shortus hadn't planned on sticking around very long at all. He entered the slaves' quarters and quickly awoken Happy Oak. Happy Oak, of course, was very drowsy and wasn't very sure as to what Shortus was saying, but Shortus was frantically trying to explain that he was with Tree and Bacchus, and this was the same Tree and Bacchus that he had helped escape the logging empire so many years ago. Now, Happy Oak has been a slave for countless years at this point, so Shortus telling him this, he did not believe him. He thought he was only a rebel telling a lie so that Happy Oak would help him escape. Unfortunately, of course, this meant Shortus would need to attempt to escape the mining empire on his own. He did have a pretty solid plan, of course. He was still so injured from the battle, they assumed that he was still sleeping in the slaves' quarters, attempting to rest and heal. They didn't think that he would even be able to muster up the strength, essentially, to try and escape the same day. Now, of course, there were guards posted at every corner, but he managed to slip past them and make his way towards the armory where he would find his weapons. He quickly brandished his rifle and his trusty cavalry sword and began making his way for the front doors. He found Sandra guarding the door and he quickly thrust his cavalry sword through her gullet, dropping her to the ground. He also had a shootout with Beryl by the helicopter and was easily able to defeat her as well. And as the sun was just now beginning to dawn, Captain Hawthorne and the others ran outside to see what the commotion was, but it was too late for them, as Shortus had already managed to get away. Hawthorne began devising a plan to send out a search party, but with Beryl and Sandra both very injured, there wouldn't be enough people to go, and also enough people to stay to take care of the children, and the wounded as well. Shortus has managed to slip right through their fingers and back into the open arms of the rebels. Shortus had been traveling on foot for a very, very long period of time. He was very hungry, and he was also very tired. He ended up collapsing from exhaustion on the ground, where he would lie for several hours on end until nightfall. However, a search party had already been sent out for him after the rebels who raided the mining empire did not return. A rebel soldier as well as his daughter Oakley managed to find him. Dear sister, I hope that you are well. The recent caravans of soldiers have yet to bring me any word from you since my last letter. I hope to speak with you very soon, as I have much to tell you, including the fact that you now have a sister-in-law and a baby niece. Now I know what you'll say. These snowy mountains are no place to raise a family, of course. I do hope to regain favor among the higher ranks so that I may leave this frozen waste soon. I love you though, dear sister. Please write back to me at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, your brother, Hawthorne. Welcome back, everyone, to our RimWorld mining empire. Today, my friends, I bring you a tale of action and a little bit of adventure. We got a lot going on today, so stay tuned. Things are very dark and quiet around the mining empire today. We're harvesting a little bit of crops, playing with some of our young children and educating them correctly, of course, just before, of course, we begin a massive strip mining operation inside of our mountain. It's time that we finally live up to the mining empire title. As our slaves, well, slave away in the mines, we can reap the beautiful benefits of all the slate and other types of minerals that they're actually harvesting for us, as well as some of the beautiful decorations that we're forcing Happy Oak to make for us for our beautiful rooms. Now, speaking of beautiful rooms, we have decided today that we should give the prison a little bit of a makeover. Now, we are terrible, dystopian, fascist people, but if we don't have a decent prison, it's going to be very hard to recruit others to become soldiers at some point, so we need to start working on that now, so in the future we'll have it ready. Something that we did not expect, however, was Happy Oak to have a damn heart attack right out there in the crop field. Beyonder came to his rescue quite quickly, showing that the slaves are really sticking together, as the soldiers really did not care. Beyonder did manage to sneak into the medical room and steal some herbal medicine to use on Happy Oak, thankfully, as without authorization from the captain, this technically was not allowed. However, if they were to find out that Happy Oak is having these medical issues, he very well may be killed, or they may sell him to some very nasty people. Now, some time later, we received word from a local marshal service commander who actually stated they had intel about a rebel caravan nearby. Hawthorne thought this the perfect opportunity to try and earn a little bit of glory and whatnot, so he ordered 2 of our soldiers to go out and take on the caravan. The caravan, of course, is most likely some type of resource caravan, or they very well may be smuggling some alcohol, some bootlegged alcohol, as well as weapons, or really anything, so they need to be stopped regardless, but of course Hawthorne is all in it for the glory and the reputation. The 2 soldiers who went, of course, were Vern and Sandra. The 2 of them seemed to be competing for Hawthorne's right-hand man position, essentially. They're both taking a lot of initiative lately. Assuming they survive this mission, one of them very well may at some point receive the promotion of lieutenant, which would be very interesting to see. That is assuming, of course, they both survive this. One of them or both of them very well may die. We are very outnumbered at this point. Even their Muffalo were trained to attack. It was quite impressive, but we didn't have time to think about how impressive it was as we were trying to kill them. As they chased after us, we did manage to knock down all 3 of those damn dirty gun-carrying beasts, and then we had to move on to the soldiers, of course. Lucky for us, rebel soldiers don't really receive the same high-quality training as us martial soldiers, so though we were outnumbered, we were much more elite in our shooting skills and things like that than they were, giving us the upper hand. Now, of course, with that being said, though, Sandra and Vern were both very injured, though. But as you can see, it would appear our suspicions were correct as well. These Muffalo were carrying several different types of weapons, mortar shells, and plenty of bootlegged alcohol. Those dirty, filthy rebels, those drunken bastards. Unfortunately, as well as we were fighting off several rebels, one of them managed to light our helicopter on fire, destroying it after quite a bit of time before we could rush back to extinguish those flames. Which unfortunately also meant that Sandra and Vern would have to hoof it all the way back to base. Luckily though, we would still be able to carry the majority of the weapons and whatnot, as well as the alcohol. Not for drinking purposes. Prohibition is still going on throughout this land, meaning it must be disposed of properly. So not too long after Sandra and Vern returned, we decided to go about doing so. And of course, the best way to cleanse our holy empire of the plague of alcohol is by fire. I know what you're thinking. Holy empire, holy land, Rat Knight, what are you? They killed refugees, innocent refugees in episode 1. Well, look. Nobody's perfect, okay? Now, some of the weapons that we got from the caravan actually used toxic gas against their enemies. It's a good thing that we found these smuggled weapons, and I think that they'll go perfectly with a comment left by our good friend Emperor Jilp, who suggested this exact thing, that we would use gas against the rebels. So once again, thank you, Emperor Jilp, for your wonderful suggestion. I do agree that it does fit with our World War I/World War II kind of environment that we have going on here. And it's an amazing thing that we actually found these smuggled toxic weapons before they were able to use them against us or any other martial service, especially us being under the mountain with a proper raid/siege against us, and those toxic weapons, they could kill all of us. And I also found that this was put very well in a comment left by our good friend Braden Bartley, who stated, "A mountain can be safety, but it can also become a tomb." This comment, of course, is less of a suggestion and more of just kind of a statement or a fact, and I just thought it was wonderful and I wanted to share it with everyone, so thank you, Braden, as well. In the meantime, though, Vern looked at his son Severn and decided that he's 4 years old now. It's about time that he equip a weapon, right? This is about the ripe age for a child soldier. So we sent him into the armory and let him put on a helmet and grab a rifle. Ah, Daddy and Mommy's little child soldier. They grow up so fast. Now, speaking of soldiers, we ended up having a hungry, cold, and angry pack of man-hunting grizzly bears who were coming to kill our soldiers. Now, of course, the grizzly bears easily fell to the might of the RimWorld Marshal Service, just as we expected them to. However, we were kind of surprised that they held up as well as they did. They were able to take several bullets before dropping to the ground, and even before dying. This kind of put it in the idea of Hawthorne that maybe these beasts could be better for just food. He began looking into ways to use them around the mining empire, as well as possibly using them in combat. Since the loss of our scout helicopter to the rebel caravan, Hawthorne has also been working on some schematics for a much larger and improved helicopter. The only problem with that is it requires a lot of components, which we do not have, so we're going to send out our very own small caravan to trade with some local settlers. It took a little while, but they finally arrived and traded with them. After returning, they had bought 30 components from the settlers, which was perfect. We could now start on this new schematic for a helicopter that Hawthorne had planned. The new design would be much more fuel efficient than the last, but better yet, it would be much larger and would be able to carry much more weight, as well as many more soldiers. The scout copter could only carry 2 people at a time, while the new helicopter can actually carry 8 people, as well as other cargo. Of course, Hawthorne is still not going to overlook the massive blunder between Sandra and Vern of losing the last one, preventing either of them from receiving a new ranking at this time. Speaking of the settlers that destroyed our scout helicopter, they have arrived nearby to try and siege our mining empire. It would appear that they were still just a tiny bit sore about us killing all those soldiers and killing those muffalo and just completely destroying their caravan. I'm not sure why they would hold a grudge about that, but here they are. They began firing some massive bombs at our mining empire. Luckily though for us, with the majority of our base being under the mountain, it was very hard for them to actually hit us. However, they did manage a few lucky shots near our generator. With that being said though, Hawthorne devised a plan that he would lead his soldiers against them in battle. So he and the other soldiers began marching off between the 2 small hills where they were hiding. Hawthorne of course began shooting several canisters of toxic gas at them in the hopes that this would knock them out or just flat out kill them essentially. The only problem was with the toxic gas canisters that we were firing at them, it would take several canisters before the effects would really take hold. So unfortunately during this time, Hawthorne was shot several times and gravely wounded. He was quickly rescued by Beryl, and Sandra, eager for the rank of lieutenant, rushed in to grab the gas canister launcher to begin firing at the rebels. However, she was also wounded during battle, and the entire team of soldiers began rushing back home. With the captain very injured and things looking very bleak, Vern stepped up to the plate. He ordered all 3 of our slaves into the armory, and he would force them to actually pick up arms against the rebels to help us in this endeavor. Under normal circumstances, this would be considered treason, but given the situation, I suppose he felt it very necessary. I know what you're thinking, this is a bit stupid of them to do this. However, take into consideration, the slaves are very outnumbered, and one of the slaves, Happy Oak, is almost 90 years old, so they hardly see him as a threat. Anyhow, he's more of a body. Sure, he is a body who can hold a gun and pull a trigger, but with the sight and strength of a 90-year-old, so he's not too much of a threat, in their eyes at least. As the rebels slept in the warm sun, whether it be from the gas poisoning they're all suffering from, or firing at us for a day and a half straight, Vern positioned all of our men and began heading towards them, where he would then throw a Molotov at their bombs, igniting them. These ignited bombs, of course, would go off, killing several of the rebels sleeping nearby them. Thankfully, just as predicted, we did end up killing several of them. Unfortunately, the other bombs nearby did not go off, but we would come in to finish the job. Vern led the soldiers and the slaves in a bit of a strafe maneuver around the invading rebels, firing at them the entire time until all of them were dead except for one lucky son of a bitch who managed to get away, unfortunately. Happy Oak had him in his sights, but unfortunately, as mentioned earlier, his aim is not what it used to be. Vern had not anticipated that during the battle several of our soldiers would be injured while hardly any of our slaves would be, meaning our slaves have a ripe opportunity on their hands while they're armed. Remembering Happy Oak's words, though, Vercott decided to give up his arms and surrender. However, Beyonder harbored fresh anger from the death of his lover recently. However, after realizing that he was vastly outnumbered without Vercott or Happy Oak's help, he also decided to surrender his weapons. Briefly after that, we also took one of the rebels prisoner. The idea here would be to try and brainwash them and convert them over to the marshals. If not, there is always the possibility of enslaving them, and if that fails as well, we could just execute them. And as we take a look around, a very chaotic and bloody scene lie in the ruins of this failed siege. The fruit of their labor with this siege ended up being to knock out power to the base with a well-placed mortar shell and to injure the captain, who is feeling much better now as well. So in other words, their efforts were entirely in vain. Well, at least in the perspective of the RimWorld marshals. But now, with the ever-looming threat of a siege out of the way, there was still a bit of business to attend to. The rank of lieutenant. Who would receive this? Sandra performed very well during battle, taking Captain Hawthorne's place with the toxic gas launcher. However, Vern also done extremely well by arming the slaves, even though that is a treasonous move any other time. So Captain Hawthorne ceremoniously rewarded Vern with rank of lieutenant for his valiant efforts in defeating the rebels who were sieging us with armed slaves, essentially, as well as soldiers. Not only that, but being able to easily control the slaves after arming them as well. All these factors combined truly show the leadership capabilities of Vern, only to be outmatched by Captain Hawthorne himself. This was truly a momentous day for him. After a long and harsh journey through the winter winds on foot, Shortus and Oakley have both finally arrived at a local rebel outpost. The guard quickly waved the both of them through, and then they entered the camp. The two of them would need to travel through several different sections of the camp before arriving at their true destination. After a bit more walking, the two of them finally arrived at a makeshift cabin in the center of the camp. Working out of this makeshift cabin was none other than Tree and Bacchus themselves. Finally, we see our heroes once again. They were very excited at the sight of Shortus returning. However, they were also extremely startled, shocked, and very puzzled by what he told them next. Happy Oak was alive. Hello, my dear friends, and welcome back for another splendid and riveting episode of our Mining Empire series. I actually have a lot to unpack for you guys today. Today's episode's not going to be exactly like any other we've done before. It is quite unique. So without further ado, let us begin. Now, when I say today's episode is going to be quite unique, I do mean that. However, it doesn't start out that way. We actually start out with Captain Hawthorne researching prosthetics. Now, a good question would be, Rat Knight, why the hell are you researching prosthetics? Let me show you. So, Konar here is missing one of her legs, just as well Sandra's jaw is shattered. Now, prosthetics won't help with the jaw, we could just go ahead and install a denture, which we plan on doing. However, when people are starting to lose limbs, probably a good idea to go ahead and start looking into some prosthetics. And one of the most beautiful things of our technology of this day and age with our fancy machinery, we can actually make prosthetic limbs at the machining table, and it cuts the time. I mean, it's a fraction of the time from the previous two series where we had to make them at a crafting spot, and it took absolutely forever. But with that being said, Happy Oak has finished up our very first prosthetic leg. We plan on installing this on Konar, and now we kind of have the technique down, so Happy Oak can make plenty of prosthetic limbs for anyone else who may need them. Just after that, of course, we had Beyonder go ahead and begin installing some of this, so he began installing the jaw on Sandra. Now, it is worth mentioning as well, everyone was talking about how Shortus was such a badass a few episodes ago when he escaped the mining empire. He is actually the one that shattered Sandra's jaw when they got into a scuffle when he was escaping. But I digress. Now, Konar has a beautiful prosthetic leg that is fully functional, just as well Sandra has a functional jaw. In the meantime, the rebel prisoners Scott were trying to brainwash, decided to go berserk and try to make an escape. Luckily, Captain Hawthorne came in with his Bowie knife and stopped him pretty easily. It also helped that he explained to him that if this were to happen again, it would cost him his life. We've also been getting several sightings of rebels at a nearby abandoned complex not too far from the base, so we decided we would take out our helicopter and go and investigate. Now, you may say to yourself that it is quite foolish of the rebels to set up a base so close to our base. However, there could be a reason for that. It is very possible they are setting up a staging ground for an attack or a siege or something of that sort on a much larger scale than we've seen. Captain Hawthorne put the helicopter down next to a small pond. From the air, we could see exactly what this abandoned complex was. The abandoned complex appears to have been a log warehouse, so this would have been where the Colonial powers back in the day before forming the Marshal Service would have stored all of their logs. On the walk to the complex, Hawthorne began recounting tales he heard as a boy growing up about a logging emperor of sorts back then. He just could not remember the name. Unfortunately, though, the conversation was cut short as they noticed several corpses in front of the complex, as well as many blood stains, skull spikes. It would appear that this place is no longer abandoned. Sandra and Sev would lead the charge here, both of them quickly breaching the door looking for enemies inside, while the others followed behind. The main room was devoid of life, however there was still a lit campfire and two separate gen stills. It would appear that this place is almost definitely populated by rebels. We would then begin clearing out the other rooms. After entering another room very quickly, a Thrumboian with a golden sword charged at our soldiers. Luckily, they fired upon him and were able to easily subdue him with their bullets. These aren't exactly the rebels that we intended on seeing here. Yes, the Thrumboians are part of the rebellion, but these Thrumboians with their own weaponry appear to be from their own tribe. It doesn't appear that Tree or Bacchus' soldiers are here just yet. However, as we continued clearing out the massive complex, we began into another room and quickly encountered a massive armored warg that was trained to attack. Luckily though, after a bit of gunplay, we were easily able to subdue it. It would appear that this is the only warg here, indicating that the force of Thrumboians in this complex, as we've previously seen as well, is not very large. So realistically, there can't be too many of them left here, I would assume. But we once again went back to clearing out the rooms of the complex. In this new room, we found a large Thrumboian male who was towering over all of us with a set of armor and a bow and arrow. We quickly downed him, and luckily he did not die, which was perfect because with his massive muscles, he would do very well in the mines. Sev also took it upon herself to clear out the final room of the complex. After entering the room, she encountered a female Thrumboian wielding a hammer. She appeared to be a blacksmith of sorts. But with the complex cleared, we could haul our new Thrumboian slaves back to base, as well as the armor and other goodies that they had here. And with that being said, as that goes on, I want to mention I apologize. There's no sound from the game right now. I didn't realize, but OBS was not capturing that. It does come back later on in the video though. It took some time, but eventually our soldiers did finally make make it all the way back home with all their new armor and resources, as well as our 2 prisoners who are going to be slaves. And so once again, to reiterate the jobs that we're going to be giving them, the larger Thrumboian male is going to be a miner, because of course he has that beautiful, massive physique for it, right? Now the younger female, or the smaller female I should say, is most likely going to be putting her smithing skills to use with the machining table and tailoring and things of that sort, essentially. The female Thrumboian blacksmith was known as Frit, and she seemed to fit right in with the other slaves. They were all stuffed in their tiny little room, which actually makes me think that maybe we should try and build them something more comfortable. But first, before we do that, we should really celebrate the victory of our soldiers with some more recreational items. We built them a new wonderful poker table and forced Happy Oak to build them a gramophone so they can all listen to music as they have their recreation activities. We also got a good shot of Larcott traveling through the dark and dreary mines. Dark as a dungeon, one might say. Yes, it is dark as a dungeon and damp as the dew. Leave a comment if you get that reference. Some time later, Konar marched into the prison and began discussing with Trog about how if he doesn't decide to join them by this point, as it's been days since he's been captured, they'll kill him, and he decides to join. Though the Thrumboians are a very noble tribe, and they are very fierce, when they're alone under a mountain in a dark, damp prison, I'm sure that they would do just about anything to get out alive. After a serious poker match between many of our soldiers, everyone began working on a large section of the mountain where we could actually put our new slave quarters, as we're getting so many more slaves. During this lengthy process, we did finally manage to also brainwash the rebel known as Scott, and he is now a RimWorld martial soldier. Captain Hawthorne even greeted him by saying, "Welcome to the right side of the war, my friend." A true heartwarming sentiment, I'm sure. Then finally, after a good bit of time had passed, we had finally completed our new slave quarters, and might I just say, it looks mighty comfortable in there, and very beautiful, compared to the last at least. The very next day, it was that time of the year. We ended up having our resource tax collectors come from the RimWorld Marshal Service. Finally, we would be able to give them plenty of slate blocks. Just as well, Captain Hawthorne had a very special letter for his sister that he would give to them so they could deliver it. Unfortunately though, unbeknownst to us and the soldiers, disaster was just around the corner. The martial soldiers had no idea they were actually being followed and tracked for many miles by a group of Thrumboians. They immediately began assaulting the resource caravan. During the beginning of the battle, it did look good for the marshals as they were heavily armed, but some accidental friendly fire changed the course of battle. A rocket hit several of the soldiers, killing them, and the Thrumboians were not letting up. The tide of battle had truly turned in the Thrumboians' favor. They still had several of their raiders as well as their animals that were armored, and unfortunately the martial soldiers were dropping like flies. After the Thrumboians had killed every single one of them, they then turned their attention towards us. Luckily though, prior to this, we had set up several slate spike traps in the caves because we knew enemies would be traveling through there. This would help us out quite a bit and would actually take out several of their dogs as well as a few of their soldiers. Now with their ranks thinned out as much as possible by the resource caravan as well as several of our traps that we laid previously, there was but one thing left to do. Open up a fine, crisp can of whoop-ass. We opened fire upon them, killing every single one that we could, and then when they began fleeing, we began pursuing them. Not even this big ugly son of a bitch and his big precious armored polar bear were enough to get away from us. But now with the raiders defeated, there was still the question of how we would deliver the resources. So we decided to have Happy Oak build a telegraph. This was long overdue. We needed this to communicate with the overall martial government on a semi-regular basis. But of course here in the northern mountains, infrastructure isn't exactly up to par, so we only just recently got telegraph lines, which did end up working out perfectly. Otherwise we would have to fly to a martial base to even just speak with them. With that being said though, the higher command have ordered Hawthorne to send some soldiers through the helicopter helicopter with all the slate blocks that we owe the government. Just as well, we have been ordered, of course, to bury our dead, which we of course planned on doing anyhow to respect them. For the resource delivery mission, Hawthorne has chosen Beryl and Scott. This would be a perfect opportunity for Scott to kind of get a feel of things on these missions, and Beryl would be the perfect person to teach him. So we began the long and lengthy process of loading up over 1,000 slate blocks to take to a local base. And now, we were speaking of infrastructure earlier with the telegraph lines, but this slate and the other resources that we're actually digging out of the mountain are going to be perfect for infrastructure such as roads and just construction in general throughout our empire. The two of them dropped off the resources and began making their way all the way back home. Everything was great. It was even hunky-dory. Hey, wait a minute. Are those rebels? Oh dear God, no. Scott and Beryl both emerged from the wreckage severely burned, but they were both alive. The helicopter, of course, was obviously destroyed. It was nothing more than metal wreckage on the ground. Beryl was burned so badly, in fact, that her nose was actually burned off in the wreckage. The two of them tended to their wounds late into the night, just before passing out from exhaustion. The only thing on their minds? To survive, to try to get back home as soon as possible, but also not to die in the process, which would mean, of course, they would need to eat to keep their strength up so they could try to return home. Luckily, they harvested some cherries from a tree, and then they would continue their journey. It would take an extremely long time to get home on foot, especially recovering from injuries. Luckily, there was a local town nearby known as Dover, controlled by the Marshal Service. They began making their way there. Days later, our two brave soldiers had finally made it just on the outskirts of the city of Dover. They began approaching the city entrance. After a brief moment of speaking with the guard at the city entrance, he explained that the city was actually under attack by a rebel uprising. He of course quickly recognized their uniforms. They were obviously soldiers from the northern mountains. Scott explained that they were under Captain Hawthorne. After hearing this, the guard begged for their assistance in the battle for the city. Given their very limited options, Beryl and Scott quickly entered the city to extinguish the flames of rebellion. They could hear gunfire in the distance as the city streets were littered with corpses, Marshal Service, and rebel. They came upon a squad of Marshal soldiers fighting off the rebels and quickly joined in. They were all packed very tightly in the city streets between the buildings. Arrows and bullets were whizzing by their heads and their bodies, hitting the sandbags in front of them, as well as hitting many of their allies standing nearby. The rebels fought very fiercely, like clockwork. It was extremely apparent that this attack had been planned out months in advance. The settlers and the Thrumboians had never worked together so well before in a battle. It was extremely impressive. However, our men did manage to beat them back just a little bit. The rebels began a strategic retreat. We also advanced to a crowded city street where many of the Marshal soldiers were fighting off several rebels as well. And of course, we quickly joined in the fight to help our brethren defeat these filthy rebels. With the rebel ranks beginning to thin, they became desperate and they began throwing the last grenades that they had at our soldiers. Unfortunately, one of these grenades landed at Beryl's feet and it detonated. Scott began sprinting towards her to pick her up and take her to safety. She was alive, but unfortunately her body was shredded by the grenade. We managed to push the rebels back and it looked as though victory would be ours. However, it was during this time that just outside the city streets of Dover, Shortus arrived with a battalion of artillerymen. This appears to be the rebels' plan B. Now that all the civilians are either dead from the marshals or they've escaped the city as well as the rebel soldiers, Shortus was free to bomb the city full of marshal soldiers. After bombing the city streets and killing as many Marshal soldiers as possible, Shortus and his battalion of artillerymen began patrolling the streets for any survivors. They came upon a Marshal soldier crying out in agony and pain on the ground, completely mangled by the bombs. Shortus, compelled by his morality, decided to kill the man to spare him of any more pain. Though the rebels hate the marshals and they are enemies, they are more sympathetic to these types of concerns, even from their enemies. Luckily, during the time of bombing, Scott had already pulled Beryl inside to begin tending to her wounds, thus the two of them did survive the bomb blast. But with that being said, Beryl is extremely injured still from the grenade that detonated on her and would still require a lot of tending. Scott, of course, promptly began attending to her wounds to ensure that she would not bleed out throughout the night. Unfortunately, though, of course, he did not have access to any medicine, so this process would take a very long time, and just as well, it was extremely painful for Beryl. So painful, in fact, that you could hear her cries of agony throughout the city streets, unfortunately, meaning that the rebels were now aware that someone was hiding within this building, and they were determined to find out who. Shortus quickly began throwing grenades at the door to blow a massive hole through it. He and the rebel soldiers entered promptly and came upon Scott wielding his rifle. If he were to drop his rifle, they would give him mercy and they would not kill him and Beryl. So, of course, with his limited options, he did comply to this order. The rebels quickly arrested both of them and began heading out of the city. Scott did not want to take this option. Obviously, he is a very prideful person, given that he is a new member of the Marshal Service as well. However, this was the only way to ensure that they both survived. Back home, Captain Hawthorne was pacing the floors, worried about our two soldiers and worried about his massive helicopter that he had just built. It had been many days since they had left. They should have been back by now, he said to himself. He decided that he would ring up the Marshal Service city that they were delivering the resources to find out if they had any information. Unfortunately, a telegraph did come back explaining that they had spotted the helicopter shot down out of the sky by what appeared to have been rebels, with no survivors in the wreckage once they sent out a search party. Hawthorne, as well as the others, were of course extremely devastated by this news. Hawthorne decided to commemorate their brave sacrifice with a memorial statue. No, it wasn't perfect, but without having any remains from the wreckage to bury, it was the best that he could do. Obviously, of course, they were completely unaware that the two of them were still alive. Shortus and his artillerymen return home after the siege of the city of Dover. Along with them are the two martial soldiers known as Beryl and Scott, both of whom were taken prisoner by Shortus and his men after their defeat, who also had only joined the Battle of Dover after their helicopter was shot down by rebel soldiers, an extremely unfortunate turn of events. Hello my dear friends and welcome back to the RimWorld Mining Empire. I'm not gonna lie to you, I still am getting over some strep throat and I probably don't sound the best, but I'm gonna do my best to give you guys a good episode here. I sure hope so at least, because today's episode is very action-packed. We have a lot going on, there's a lot to unpack and to break down today, and a lot to discuss. One of the biggest things to discuss, probably our number one concern at this time, or at least for the Marshals in general, rebel attacks are at an all-time high. Even here in the northern mountains, where it is very cold and whatnot, and you wouldn't think that there'd be a lot of movement, the rebels are extremely active, shockingly. So with that being said, we need to think of better ways to defend ourselves from rebel sieges and rebel attacks. So one of the very first things we're going to be doing today is deconstructing a lot of our old defenses to make room for some new ones, as well as kind of expanding our borders with the defenses. Just as well, something that we're trying to make room for is a landing strip. Now, I hear you say to yourself, a landing strip? What? Rat Knight, what are you talking about? Well, let me ask you this. What is the best defense? Did you say a good offense? You're so stupid. Oh, no, wait. Actually, yes, you are correct. It is a good offense. So, something that I feel would be a wonderful offense would be a plane. If we had a plane at the Mining Empire, for one, we could help defend surrounding settlements around us, or even engage in good offenses against rebels who are on missions, things like that. But we could also use it to offensively defend the Mining Empire when we're getting raided. However, that's all well and good, but a plane takes a lot of components, so we had sent out a caravan to retrieve plenty of components for it. us. And to which, of course, they returned. I think we needed like 74 components or something like that. I think we got a little bit over that or right around that. We had traded a lot of the firearms that we got through previous raids to the local settlements for these components. In the meantime, though, we began working on our landing strip because a plane without a landing strip is like a Rat Night video without some shitty jokes. It just doesn't work. That took a little while, but once it was finally complete, Captain Hawthorne commissioned Happy Oak to build our beautiful bomber. Now, we felt that this transition from helicopters to planes was a brilliant idea as well, and the reason for that, planes are much faster, they fly much higher, it's going to be a lot harder for the rebels to shoot down a bomber than it would be for a helicopter. Now, of course, that does not mean that we're giving up on helicopters completely. We may build another in the future, assuming, of course, we have the resources anytime soon. We do have to give some of those to the overall government so they can continue with infrastructure as well as the war effort. But of course, our plans of planes and helicopters only go so far as our fuel will take us, right? If we run out of gas in the sky, it's going to be a bad day. So to help with this, so we're not constantly having to buy fuel, we had Lieutenant Verne build us a biofuel refinery. This bad boy is going to allow us to turn plant matter into fuel. And there's no doubt in my mind that this is some type of ambitious schematic that was originally drawn up by Captain Hawthorne in his studies. In the meantime, though, we began some strip mining operations on some very small sandstone hills nearby the Mining Empire base. We're going to attempt to ramp up operations here at the Mining Empire with rebel attacks at an all-time high. The Empire is going to be needing resources now more than ever throughout this war. We ended up starting a bit of a strip mining operation just above the base directly north. After digging through this section, we realized that the western side was actually completely hollow, a section that we originally thought was just more mountain. Sometime later, we ended up receiving a telegraph stating that there were some rebels camped out nearby with what appeared to be an item stash. Now, this item stash could be many things. It could be bootlegged alcohol, it could even be toxic bombs and whatnot, as we had seen previously. Regardless, we needed to take care of this. Now, given the heightened threat against flying vehicles recently, Captain Hawthorne thought it would be a good idea if they scouted out on foot first and then had air support come in later. Now, they had no way to easily communicate this information back to the Mining Empire, so the idea was that if Captain Hawthorne and the others came back, that means that they saw something and the plane should not take off. Now, I know that may sound stupid, but if the captain doesn't come back from the mission at all, that plane needs to fly and find it. Plus, we don't have portable radios just yet, so there was no easy way to communicate without bringing a massive radio with them, which maybe is a viable option for the future though. Regardless though, not too long after we arrive at the item stash, Lieutenant Verne began loading himself and some bombs up in the plane to provide us with air support. He immediately took off and began heading this way, where he then promptly dropped 2 cans of large ass kickery on those rebel sons of bitches. Actually, now that I think of it, maybe it was just 1 can, but look, we're still learning to fly the damn thing. Don't get your panties in a twist. Just after the bomb detonated, Captain Hawthorne moved the team up into position and began firing at the remaining rebels. With most of them injured or killed from the bomb, they were easily dispatched by Hawthorne and the team. The team then got into position near the item stash and prepared to open it. Let's see what those damn dirty rebels are trying to smuggle under our noses. Just as we had feared, it would appear they were smuggling a couple of mortars and several different types of mortar shells. However, this group is very small to be a siege. It is very possible they were delivering these weapons, or they had planned up to meet with a larger group to then perform the siege. These weapons could have even been a part of an attack that was coming for us. Regardless though, I'm just happy that we found these and we were able to defeat the rebels. The journey back home would be quite long, as Hawthorne had decided that he would walk the squad all the way back. Sure, we could have asked Lieutenant Verne to pick us up in the plane, but the problem is if there's some rebels hiding somewhere and we don't see them, they could get a lucky shot and then it's over. It is going to be extremely important that we use this plane very strategically. It costs a lot of resources, but something that we can't get back is Beryl as well as Scott. I also want to take a moment to address the fact that I've always called Beryl Beryl for some reason. I don't know why I read it like that, and I apologize. I bet you guys want to stick a pencil in your ear every time you heard that, but I am ever so glad that you didn't. Now, some time later, we ended up having 2 nomads who said that a flash storm had burnt down their village and they needed a place to stay for a while. Now, what that sounded like to Captain Hawthorne is that they needed jobs as soldiers here and or slaves. So he quickly accepted their offer of enlistment and or free labor, whether they knew that or not. As the two nomads approached, the captain as well as a few of our soldiers met them out there on the helipad. The captain quickly ordered two of our soldiers to approach the two nomads and then, of course, arrest them. However, the nomads did not like this idea, and one of them even fought back. Fought back, as it were. Fought, as in past tense, as in, like something you might say if someone is dead now. Hey, but that's okay. Hey, look, calm down. Don't sweat it. Don't worry about it. Because, look, best 1 out of 2 ain't too bad. We got one nomad. Sure, one of them's getting put in the body pile, but we might have a soldier and or miner on our hands here. Now, some time later, Captain Hawthorne ordered Happy Oak to work on a new schematic for a bomb crafting bench. These new bombs, of course, would be what we would be dropping from our planes. I suppose the rebel item cache has the captain a bit on edge, a bit paranoid. Given the mortars and the mortar shells and whatnot that we found there, though, it's a bit hard to blame him for being paranoid. As we've seen on that mission as well, though, dropping bombs from our plane was an excellent offense. However, the bomb that we had dropped on the item cache mission was simply, I think, 200 pounds, 220 pounds, something like that. The captain has something better in mind. The captain has crafted a prototype 1,000-pound unguided bomb. Now, how effective will this bomb really be against rebels? That is still to be determined, but if we were to have a siege or any massive raids, we'll definitely be able to find out. Some time later, after several attempts, Konar finally broke the spirits of the nomad known as Norman. With her spirits broken, she decided, hey, you know what, maybe I'll join these people and die in their war, which we were grateful for. We allowed her to don a rifle and one of our beautiful brown winter operations uniforms. Now she fits right in with the rest of us. She was so grateful and excited for this new opportunity to die for our cause, she even threw a party for everyone under the Empire. Truly a kind act, of course. If only we could have more soldiers like Norman. Hopefully, as we have more refugees and more nomads and rebels and things like that, we can try to convert them over to martialism. But with that being said, we now have a massive group of rebels who are coming to try and siege the mining empire. It would appear that those weapons that we had found originally at the item stash were related to this siege. They were most likely going to link up with these rebels to try and attack us. However, we did just recently create a prototype massive unguided bomb, which we feel may be useful in this situation. So Hawthorne decided to take Norman on a bombing run so she can kind of get the idea of it. And hey, if it works, no more rebels. The bomb has been dropped and... whoa. I would say that that was a successful bomb. It would appear that Captain Hawthorne has really outdone himself once again with his schematics and research into these types of weapons. With enough of these unguided 1,000-pound bombs, or even larger bombs at that, we could level entire rebel cities. However, of course, the only limiting factor there is the fact that we would have to use fuel and steel every single time, and fuel is a bit scarce here in the northern mountains, even with trees and stuff like that. With biofuel refining, we don't have a lot of trees. But maybe with this successful test of this bomb, we could convince the overall government with a bit of funding for some fuel or something like that. Now, in the meantime, we are going to be digging out a fairly large section of the mountain to add on to the base, and the reason we are doing this is for animals. Yes, we want plenty of animals here. Well, by plenty I mean probably like wargs or dogs or something like that, as shown in a comment from our good friend known as Bone Growth. Bone Growth, I totally agree with you. However, I don't know if we'll be able to get wargs. The only wargs we've seen here in the north are the ones that the rebels actually use against us, so I'm not sure, but we'll find something. I wasn't really looking for any riding animals per se, more of like attack and defense animals. We don't really need riding animals, I don't think, because we have helicopters and planes and stuff like that, so we want to go for wargs or dogs or something for defense. And the problem being as well, we don't have wolves or wargs or anything here in the north, hardly ever. I think the only thing I've really ever seen is maybe like a polar bear or a grizzly bear or something like that up this way, so we can't tame animals. So the idea was that we would load up a bunch of guns into our plane and fly to local settlements to try and buy animals. Unfortunately though, they did not have any animals to sell, so we only ended up buying fuel. Which was fine because we did actually need fuel like we talked about earlier, but you can't train a can of fuel to attack your enemies, or can you? No, unfortunately you cannot. That is what we in the business call a joke. Ironically though, after our soldiers returned home, we ended up having a caravan from these same settlements who were coming here originally to trade with us, and they actually ended up having Labrador retrievers, so go figure. Unfortunately, they only had 3 Labrador retrievers, but that's fine because I think there were 2 females and 1 male, so we can breed them to be an unstoppable martial dog force. Of course, at some point that will mean that someone will need the official title of Hound Master. So based on, I believe it was Nubian Beauty's comment, I think from the last episode or episode before, she wanted us to give the children mineral-like names. Well, since we don't have a lot of children, I've decided that we'll start giving those to animals as well. And since we're only breeding these 3 dogs for the entire empire, that means we're going to have inbred dog babies, baby. It is a Rat Night tradition that every series we must have some type of inbred animals in our empire. And by God, I will not break tradition today. Sometime later, and Captain Hawthorne called Severn and Slate into the armory. It was time that these little youngsters learn how to shoot some machine guns. You never know when you might have an occupying enemy force take over your entire empire, and then your children have to try and kill people. I should put that on a t-shirt. Anyhow though, he marched their stubby little legs through the deep snow just due north where he had set up a few barrels for some target practice. Captain Hawthorne gave them the green light. The 2 little tykes just had the biggest smiles on their faces. They were so excited to unleash death upon these barrels. This little training exercise would also help Captain Hawthorne realize that the 2 of them needed a lot more practice, so he would let Lieutenant Verne know so that they could take them out on more practice shootings, hunting trips, things like that. Just a good bit of good old fatherly bonding. And now with that being said, a little bit of time later, I think we realized that Trog, our massive Thrumboian miner that we enslaved, is having a little bit of trouble seeing in the dark, and he would also like to have a nice mining helmet, just like Happy Oak and Lurcott. Well, to be fair, what he would really like is his freedom, and to probably kill every single soldier in the Marshal Service government. But that'll never happen. You better just stick to the mines, Trog, you big lug, you big silly boy. While the slaves are mining away, Hawthorne and Lieutenant Verne thought this would be a good ample opportunity for some of that nice fatherly bonding on a hunting trip to kill a mega sloth. They even decided to bring their 3 new hounds along with them. This massive mega sloth would be some crucial calories throughout the winter for our soldiers. Not only that, of course, though, this would be an ample learning experience once again for the children on shooting discipline in general, hunting, etc., all these great things. It was also the first hunt for our dogs as well, so this would be a good demonstration of just how powerful they would be in small numbers even, and just how useful the dogs would actually be to the colony. We brought the mega sloth back home where Frit would cut it up and turn it into meals for all of our wonderful soldiers and mediocre slaves. Now, something interesting about Frit here that I have not mentioned yet is the fact that she and our beautiful Thrumboian miner Trog here are now lovers. This happened a little while back, but I forgot to mention it. Just as well though, this is a secret. It's not as though they're going around telling everyone, because obviously the marshals would not like this. Plus, if they were to accidentally have any children or anything like that, it could cost them all their lives. However though, sometime later we received a massive resource collection caravan that came in the dead of night. Now this caravan was heavily guarded, not only by soldiers but also by several hounds as well as massive armored megasloths. These new means of protection and whatnot, and the size and power of this caravan is no doubt due to the last one being attacked. Based on what I'm seeing here with this caravan, however, I'm almost positive it would take a small to medium-sized army of rebels to actually take it down. The idea here this time around is that we are going to be providing them with plenty of slate once again, and the reason we keep providing the Empire essentially with slate, it is our most common resource here under the mining empire. We're also going to be providing them with a little bit of steel. Now Now, we don't have a lot of steel because of all the defenses, the planes, and helicopters we've been having to make, so we'll only be able to give a little bit of that, unfortunately. Now, while our soldiers were loading up the resource caravan with slate blocks, Captain Hawthorne was actually talking to the private. He ended up giving him a letter that was meant for his sister. Just as well, the private was also letting him know about a local raid that was being conducted against a group of rebels. There is a small settler town nearby that is actually a rebel hideout, and the attack against them is being led by a martial captain known as Mitchell. Now, of course, Captain Hawthorne is familiar with Captain Mitchell, so he had the decision to make. Would he fly in with the plane and try to give him some backup? Mitchell wasn't exactly a good friend of Hawthorne's or anything like that, but he was part of the Marshal Service, damn it. They would have to go in and help their friends in this battle. Even if Captain Mitchell can handle the battle on his own, and it's hard to say because he too, just as Captain Hawthorne, has a very small squad of soldiers, at the very least our assistance may make their victory go quicker. And who knows, it very well may turn out that they were in desperate need of our help. Unfortunately, we don't have any more 1,000-pound bombs, which probably for the best we would level the town, but we do have a few more 200-pound bombs. And these 200-pound bombs are going to be much better for some precision strikes, so if there's any groups of rebels that we could drop them on, or any artillery or anything like that. Cut to the small town known as Preston that was being liberated by Captain Mitchell and his forces. It would appear that the rebels were dug in extremely deep. It is possible that Captain Mitchell and his men did have this under control, but I am glad that we showed up. Mitchell appeared to be using toxic gas against the rebel scum, which is a wonderful plan, to be honest with you, because the rebels have very little access to gas masks and things like that. They were even shelling the city streets with toxic gas mortar shells. However, with that being said, it would appear that a small group of artillerymen just outside the town were also about to begin shelling the Marshal soldiers. This would be extremely catastrophic for Mitchell and his team. It's a good thing that we're around. It's also a good thing that we had already planned for a situation just like this. We bombed the rebel artillery, destroying them. Hawthorne and his small team landed the plane nearby. We did have a few more bombs left, however, the battle was so tight-knit within the city at this point, if we were to begin bombing inside the city, friendly fire was almost a guarantee. So instead, we decided to enter the town of Preston on foot, where we would join in with Captain Mitchell. We saw the captain's men running by all of our soldiers, and then the captain sped by us on a horse. With them advancing farther into the city, it would appear that they were pushing the rebels back, but as previously mentioned, of course, they are digging in deeper and deeper by the second, so of course we pursued behind them shortly after. As Hawthorne and his squad approached, Mitchell was already in a gunfight with the rebels. An icy breeze blew through the frozen streets of the town, but any noise of an icy breeze was toned out by all the gunfire. An icy breeze was also not the only thing that was filling the streets of the town. Mitchell's team was filling the streets with plenty of poisonous gas for the rebels. They had almost no way to combat this, of course. There was only one thing for them to do. They sent Thrumboian warriors to flank our soldiers from the side. This was, of course, in an effort to try and get the upper hand over our soldiers and stop the toxic gas from flowing, then giving them an advantage. Luckily, we did defeat them, however. With many of the rebels dead, Mitchell decided to take a team through the city streets to try and kill the others. Captain Mitchell would take Norman and Colonial along with him, leaving several of his troops, of course, under the command of Captain Hawthorne, during which point some rebels began donning gas masks, and just as well, unfortunately, they would also break out the big guns. Luckily, Hawthorne did not die. However, his body was extremely mangled from the explosion. Sandra and the other soldiers rushed as fast as they could to try and get him inside. But of course, the streets were still littered with rebel soldiers everywhere. However, luckily, we did manage to find an empty building where no one was occupying, and that way we could take the captain inside and try to tend to his wounds and stop the bleeding before he died. A grueling task, no doubt, but it had to be done. On the other side of town, Mitchell led the team team of soldiers to an occupied building that they felt was stuffed with rebel soldiers. This building was said to have been the original base for the rebels in this town, making it a very obvious target for the marshals, of course. The idea here is that Mitchell would give the signal and then we would breach the doors. Just like a flash, Mitchell gave the signal and entered the building, and we were all quickly engaged by rebel soldiers. One of our men accidentally fired a toxic gas canister into the building. Attempting to not breathe in the toxic gas, the rebel soldiers began to try and flee out of the entrance where they were engaged by our soldiers. Many of them died, and the others actually ended up surviving and getting away. It was hard to see through the gas. Norman stripped one of our soldiers of their gas mask and equipped it for herself. She was hell-bent on killing any rebels within the building. Just as well, though, she would need to engage any rebels within the building to distract them so that Konar could try and rescue any soldiers, such as Captain Mitchell. Upon entering the next room, a very large room I might add, Norman was shocked to see that it was completely empty. No furniture, no resources, no rebels. But there was a voice shouting from a small room. Upon entering the room, we discovered Scott, covered in blood and soot and ash. It would appear that the rebels had been keeping him captive here. He quickly explained to Norman who he was and that he was originally part of the team just before she joined, of course, and Norman took him into custody. He unfortunately made no mention of Betrayal or anything that may have happened to her, but we'll ask him about that later. The two of them began to leave the building to group up with the other soldiers. After we finally were able to get everyone back to the base, Captain Hawthorne and Captain Mitchell both were in critical condition, both of them extremely injured. Captain Hawthorne's entire body was basically shredded by that rocket, just as well Captain Mitchell had taken a shotgun blast to the face. But with all things considered, both of them were still alive, and truly that was the most important thing. We could always try and recover from our injuries, but death is inescapable. But I do feel that this scene of the two of them laying together here in the medical bay with blood just smeared all across the floor truly shows just how much of a toll that battle took on them. Of course, it was well worth it because we did liberate the town of Preston and it is now under martial control. Just as well, we did manage to recover Scott, who I might add is now currently having an interview with Lieutenant Verne on exactly as to what happened and led to him being in that small room in the town of Preston. The story seemed believable enough. Scott explained exactly what happened after the helicopter was shot out of the sky. He and Betrayal attempted to survive in the wilderness until coming upon the town of Dover, where they then joined the marshals in a battle. Of course, they were defeated in that battle and captured by Shortus and his artillerymen. He explained that the rebels interrogated the two of them, and Betrayal attempted to escape several times, leading to her inevitable death, unfortunately. Scott was then transferred to the town of Preston, where the rebels had planned on using him as leverage in terms of some type of bargaining chip, essentially. He was also there with several other soldiers who we saw in the room, but unfortunately they were killed. Lieutenant Verne seemed to be fairly convinced by the story that Scott had told and allowed him to rejoin them there at the mining empire. Only time will tell, however, if trusting Scott once again was the right choice. In the dead of night, a lone martial postman walks the road as an icy wind grips him. He approaches a small, isolated home at the end of the road. Out of this isolated home walks none other than Maya Hawthorne. The postman quickly drops off the letter to the captain's sister and then begins his journey elsewhere. Dear sister, I hope that you are well. The recent caravans of soldiers have yet to bring me any word from you. Hello everyone and welcome back to the RimWorld Mining Empire. We begin our episode in our medical bay where Mitchell is still having bullets pulled out of his face and Hawthorne's shredded wounds are still being stitched together. The recovery process for both of them will no doubt be very difficult, but let us begin. Now, I said that the recovery process is going to be long, and I do still stand by that statement. However, Captain Mitchell luckily is up and walking around, which is a magnificent start. However, Captain Hawthorne is still extremely injured, so we've decided to utilize this time to commission some prosthetic limbs for him. At this time, Captain Hawthorne only needs a prosthetic arm and a prosthetic leg unless infection sets in and takes some other limbs, which hopefully that does not happen. Our slave Trog had made the very first prosthetic leg for the captain, and Sev came into the room to install the new limb. But she completely fumbled the entire thing and managed to injure the captain more. Needless to say, he was not very pleased by this. However, he ended up being cheered up quite a bit by seeing young Slate come to visit him. Nothing that a father loves more than the beautiful sight of his young children. Even an awful, homicidal piece of shit like Hawthorne has a little bit of a heart. In the meantime, Scott entered the armory to equip a new winter operations uniform. It was about time that he got back up to speed with everything in the mining empire, such as the fact that this winter has been extremely cruel to us all, and everyone is becoming very hungry as we were getting low on food. So he and the others, as well as Captain Mitchell, decided they would go on a bit of a muffalo hunt. Now, all was well and good because we had basically an entire squad of soldiers hunting these muffalo, but it was during this time that Mitchell had mentioned that as soon as Captain Hawthorne is healed, back on his feet and back in command, that he will be attempting to leave the mining empire and go back home. Scott appeared to take very close note of this information as well. It may be possible that he didn't quite trust Captain Mitchell, though I suppose only time will tell. In the meantime, though, in the comfort of his own room, Sev came back for round 2 to attempt to install these prosthetic limbs. Hawthorne lay there in the bed, only hoping and praying that this time she did it right, and luckily she did. She would also go on to install a prosthetic arm to replace the one that was blown off from the rocket attack. Now the only thing for Hawthorne to do would be to get used to these new prosthetic limbs, as well as wait for this anesthesia to wear off so he can get up and move around. But of course, being the prideful bastard that he is, Hawthorne decided to go against doctor's orders. He was even moving around the base with anesthesia still basically in full effect, puking in the hallways, and it was disgusting. But of course, no one dared to question the captain. Now with that being said as well, in the meantime, I noticed that we had some beautiful Labrador Retriever babies from the labs that we bought last episode. We would of course need to do plenty of training and armoring for these dogs so that they could be our vicious martial hounds. Unfortunately though, the very next day we ended up having a large raid of Thrumboians come nearby. Now these Thrumboians were extremely heavily armored, but not only that, they had armored thrumbos along with them. They and their chieftain had brought 3 massive adult thrumbos with thick steel armor to try and penetrate through our lines. These massive creatures posed quite the threat to us all, as they could take several bullets before even really beginning to bleed. As they planned their attack, we decided that it would probably be best, instead of allowing them to plan and attack us, if while they were planning we attacked them preemptively. So during this time, both our captains, Mitchell and Hawthorne, began loading up bombs that are meant for planes into our artillery guns to fire at the thrumbos. The reasoning behind this is they're so close to the base they would see the plane take off and most likely be able to take cover before the bombs were dropped. If we were to fire them from artillery guns, they would not have that much time. And this strategy did seem to pay off, as after firing several bombs and normal artillery shells, we ended up killing several of the Thrumboians, including their chieftain. Unfortunately though, we did not manage to kill a single thrumbo, which is not shocking as they're basically walking tanks with that armor. We had our soldiers bring down our mounted machine guns and cluster them all together in one area. This would basically create a very narrow barrage of bullets coming from us towards the Thrumboians. And with all of our soldiers and weapons clustered together, it would also make it much easier to manage them throughout the battle. As the Thrumbos and Thrumboians began marching towards us, we began raining down hellfire upon them. As you can see though, even our massive mounted machine guns were struggling to take down the Thrumbos. We ended up having to release our hounds against them to try and keep them away from our soldiers, and unfortunately in doing so we would end up losing several of our hounds. Our hounds' sacrifice would not go in vain though. After killing several more Thrumboians, we did manage to make them flee. Unfortunately, throughout the entire battle though, we only managed to kill a single Thrumbo. And just as well, those Thrumbos managed to kill 2 of our Labrador retrievers, with 1 very, very injured. This was very frightening to our soldiers, as this was but a fraction of the power the Thrumboians were beginning to muster in the region. Hawthorne began speaking to Mitchell and Lieutenant Verne. They began devising a bit of a plan for a show of force, something that would make the Thrumboians think twice about attacking us again. Of course, though, these plans would take quite a while to come up with, so in the meantime, while talks were ongoing, Captain Hawthorne was also attempting to enslave one of the Thrumboians that he had captured from the raid. It was during this time as well that he got information out of the Thrumboian that there was a local village that they had all come from nearby. Hawthorne thought this village the perfect target for his attack, but for his attack they would need fuel. Where would they get fuel? Hawthorne came up with the horrific plan of cutting up the Thrumboians that had attacked us to turn them into biofuel to use for missiles as well as fueling our plane. Truly a disgusting and devious tactic come up with by a disgusting and devious man. However, I would also like to give credit to Misanthropic Humanist and Volt for these suggestions as well. It does seem very much like the type of disgusting, abhorrent thing that the Marshals, especially Captain Hawthorne, would do. The plan that Captain Hawthorne has devised is truly wicked and evil. He plans on cutting up these Thrumboians, turning them into biofuel as mentioned, and creating missiles with him and attacking their very own village, civilians, a village of civilians, with these missiles. Honestly though, in a very dark, sickening, twisted sense, it's quite poetic though. Not in a good way though. No, listen. I think that this is a disgusting, horrible thing. I'm just the narrator, okay? The narrator who also made them do this, but whoa, let's not pay attention to that part. Let's move on. Captain Hawthorne was creating 2 large, devastating 1,000-pound unguided bombs during this time as well though. Trog has went berserk. His flames of rebellion have ignited and he is going to attempt to escape. He was quickly confronted though by Captain Mitchell, who rushed into the mines, dual-wielding pistols firing at him. Trog was quite the unit though, and even followed Captain Mitchell outside where the 2 of them would engage in a fistfight. Well, sort of a fistfight. Captain Mitchell pulled out a knife on him and began stabbing him. After he was captured and his wounds were tended to, Captain Hawthorne ordered Trog to come outside. After Trog approached the captain and the lieutenant, the both of them explained to him that he was going to be a crucial part in the bombing of the Thrumboian village. Initially, of course, Trog completely refused to help them in any way, shape, or form until Captain Hawthorne mentioned that they would maybe have a few words with his lover Frit. Yes, Captain Hawthorne is no fool. He knew of this relationship between the 2 slaves the entire time, only awaiting until it could be useful to him to mention it. With Frit's life in danger, Trog reluctantly boarded the bomber with Captain Hawthorne and Lieutenant Verne to set out on this mission. On the flight to the Thrumboian village, Captain Hawthorne and Lieutenant Verne reinforced it in Trog's mind several times that if he did not listen to exactly what their orders were, there would be consequences, including not only the torture and murder of his lover, Frit, but also of the innocent Thrumboian citizens. For you see, today was not only a normal day for the Thrumboians, but today was actually an ancestral holiday for this tribe, meaning that the vast majority of tribal citizens would be gathered. The citizens all gathered around their ancestral village of Talor. They all had many festivities and wonderful parties and things planned for this ancestral holiday. The holiday in question was called the Day of Deum. Deum is actually their ancestral word for the name of this planet. Throughout the Day of Deum, the Thrumboians are all giving thanks for the beautiful things that they have, the beautiful planet that they inhabit, and they're all just gathered around with their families. Unfortunately, however, these beautiful celebrations of all the Thrumboians gathering with their families and gathering with their fellow Thrumboian in mass are exactly what Captain Hawthorne and Lieutenant Verne are planning on. What we are currently looking at is the calm before the storm, and I'd like to take it in for a few more moments, as I've never really shown all of you the civilians throughout this planet, but there are many villages and cities and towns all across the planet that aren't really involved in the wars. Sure, they have soldiers and warriors, but these people are not fighting, these are just civilians. But civilians are exactly who they plan on targeting. Captain Hawthorne and Lieutenant Verne loaded Trog up with 11 mortar shells. They ordered Trog to enter the town under the guise of being a returning Thrumboian civilian, enter the community building where all the others were gathered, and detonate the shells. Trog was completely out of options. The fate of this village was sealed, but the fate of Frit and the other slaves was not, so maybe in doing this and horrible task, he could save their lives. At this point in Trog's life, he was a slave. He had nothing to his name, and he had felt that it was all coming to an end anyhow. The only thing truly that he had left was Frit and the other slaves that he had befriended, and for them, he would do anything. Many, but not all, of the Thrumboians had begun gathering in their community center for their ancestral festivities. As Trog wandered through the town, as the Thrumboians were all celebrating in the community center, he couldn't help but wonder to himself if things had been different. If he had done things differently, would he be celebrating in this very building with this same community as someone walked in to do what he would do today? As the music from the drums and the singing blare in the background, Trog walked into the building. He walked into the center of the room, and then, within the blink of an eye and the flash of an explosion, all 11 mortar shells went off, killing every single Thrumboian inside, of course including Trog. As the Thrumboian citizens were scrambling throughout the town to find out what's going on, Lieutenant Verne and Captain Hawthorne boarded their plane to deliver the final blow. The tribespeople heard the plane overhead and attempted to take cover in their homes, but unfortunately this would do nothing. The 2,000-pound bombs that Hawthorne and Verne dropped leveled the city, killing hundreds of civilians. Many of these innocent civilians that were killed were Thrumboian children. The mining empire has put its foot down, a show of force that will ring out across the entire planet. Word of this atrocious act will no doubt go down in history as one of the most horrific attacks against Thrumboian tribes the planet has seen. With their horrible, evil, vile deeds committed, Hawthorne and Verne took off to return home to the mining empire. You know, I must say that we have seen some horrible and evil acts committed by the Marshal Service, but truly nothing specifically targeting civilians like Hawthorne has today. Hawthorne and Verne landed the bomber on the airstrip and then began to go inside. Frit met them outside, looking for Trog. Frit was completely unaware of what had truly happened, as were the other slaves. They were kept in the dark on the situation, as Hawthorne had simply told them that they sold Trog, which no one really believed for sure, as Trog was a massive unit of a Thrumboian man who could dig through slate like butter. There would be no reason for them to sell him. Yes, he did have a bit of a rebellious act there for a moment, but he was so useful to the mining empire, it's just unbelievable that they would actually sell him. Of course, though, Captain Hawthorne told the soldiers what had truly happened, and everyone was extremely ecstatic with their victory. The poor slaves were none the wiser, and they all slept in their quarters that night, hoping that maybe one day we would see Trog again. Everyone also wondered what had truly happened to Trog that the marshals were not telling us about, and could this same thing that happened to Trog happen to any one of us? As everyone was tucked tight into their beds pondering these questions, Scott entered the room brandishing his pistol. Scott quickly began to wake all the slaves up and explained that he had a task for them all. But before the task, he would explain to them that Trog was killed. Seeing the anger bubble up in all the slaves, Scott explained that it was not his fault, and if they wished to have vengeance, he would give that to them. The slaves followed Scott through the hallway all the way into the dining room. They all walked into the dining room where Captain Mitchell sat. Scott explained that Captain Mitchell was responsible for Trog's capture, and thus also responsible for his horrific punishment. The gang of slaves quickly moved in on Captain Mitchell and quickly beating the absolute shit out of him. But the captain was still alive, and this just would not do. Vigilante justice must be enacted on the captain. The slaves all gathered round and took him outside. They would lie the captain down on the icy, cold helipad and prepare him for his execution. With one simple bullet, Happy Oak took the man's life. No doubt that words cannot express the catharsis that the slaves felt from finally sticking it to the marshal service and killing one of those guilty officers. But there was still the matter of not getting caught. With daylight coming up, everyone would wake up soon. Frit decided to dispose of Captain Mitchell's body deep in the mines, hidden away from all the other soldiers. However, there was still the question as to why Scott decided to help the slaves. When no one was around, Happy Oak entered his room to discuss with him. Scott immediately began to explain exactly what had happened to Happy Oak. He stated that a majority of what he had actually told the soldiers here was somewhat true, though a bit of the truth had been stretched. For example, he explained that Beryl wasn't actually dead. She was actually scheduled for execution, however, after her interrogation by the rebels. He also explained to Happy Oak that the rebels were aware of Captain Mitchell's assault on the city of Dover weeks ahead of time, and thus they had planted him in that building. He also explained that Tree and Shortus considered him a deserter, and the only way to win his freedom back was by double-crossing the marshals. Scott also explained to Happy Oak that Tree and Bacchus were truly alive, and not only that, they would be arriving very shortly. Back at the undisclosed rebel hideout, Tree and Shortus lie together in the early morning hours. However, with that being said, Tree would be getting up very soon as she and her mother Bacchus had plenty of work to do. Today was a very big day for the both of them as they had a very busy schedule. Tree began making her way throughout the halls of the base all the way down to the prison. Tree quickly entered the prison and began heading for one of the closed cells. Upon entering this closed cell, she would find her mother Bacchus beating the martial prisoner known as Beryl senseless for answers. After being viciously attacked by Bacchus several times, Beryl began spilling secrets of the inner workings of the mining empire and the inner layout of the base itself in areas that Shortus was unable to visit in his brief stint there. After providing Tree and Bacchus with as much information as she could, she would then be shown mercy. Her little vacation here in the rebel base was about to come to an end. Tree hauled the filthy martial scum out into the center of the base for all to see. She threw Beryl to the ground and then ran her knife across her throat, killing her. With the interrogation of Beryl providing them with plenty of useful information, there was but one thing left for them to do. It was finally time for them to march against the mining empire. Hello everyone and welcome back to the RimWorld Mining Empire. My friends, it is my great honor today to bring you the final episode of the Mining Empire series. The Mining Empire series will end today in this episode, but will the actual mining empire fall? Well, that is a wonderful question, and it is up to you and me and my gravelly strep voice to find out. Let's begin. Yes, as you can probably hear in my voice, and I hope it's not that bad, I am sick once again. I feel like absolute shit, but I am still going to try to get this video out for you guys, so I hope the voice isn't too much of a distraction. I think I sound okay, per se. But to begin our episode, we have Lieutenant Vern and Scott going on an elk hunt to bring back some wonderful meat to the others. Now, the pair were not only discussing hunting elk during this hunting trip, though, they were also discussing how Captain Mitchell appears to have left in the dead of night to go back home as he had planned for more missions and things like that, of course. Scott was very excited to hear Lieutenant Vern speaking in such a manner because it would appear that the other soldiers were none the wiser as to what really occurred, which was exactly what he had hoped for, because if the other soldiers were to find out about Captain Mitchell's body deep in the mines before Bacchus and Tree could arrive for what they had planned, it could cause a few ripples throughout the entire mining empire and could cause some issues with the plan that he had developed. What exactly was Tree and Bacchus's plan? Well, unfortunately, Scott did not know. He only knew that they were going to set out on some type of rescue mission to liberate the slaves and try to take down the mining empire. They didn't necessarily trust Scott fully, as he had already switched sides once before. It was during this time as well, while waiting on Tree and Bacchus and everyone to arrive for the rescue mission, or the liberation mission, we should say, our slaves continued carrying out their mining duties. Because just as Happy Oak told Lurkot in episode 1, the time for rebellion would come, but it is not now. Now, as our slaves are waiting for their liberation, Captain Hawthorne continued his devious research into weapons. His current research project would be into super heavy bombs. Super heavy bombs, of course, are much larger than the current bomb technology that we have, and just as we seen last episode, our current technology is extremely devastating. Now, bombs, of course, are extremely powerful, but what if enemies were to make it inside the base? That is a good question. That is also why we are continuing to train up our small squad of Labrador Retrievers. I have named the two puppies, Cole and Boulder. Of course, just trying to stick with our theme of mineral names for animals and babies throughout the colony. Sometime later, late in the night, we ended up receiving a bulk goods trader from a nearby settlement, which was perfect as we were in the market for purchasing some more components, just as well as fuel for these bombs that Captain Hawthorne is researching. Because naturally, of course, the laws of nature and whatnot, the bigger the bomb, the more fuel it's going to take. And the bigger the bomb, the bigger the boom, which is very important for us. These prototype bombs that Captain Hawthorne is working on is actually a very ambitious project, because to the knowledge of Hawthorne and the others, bombs of this size, magnitude, and just power overall have never been utilized throughout this war. With enough bombs this size and power, this could turn the tide of the war. Now, of course, for such an important project, Hawthorne is tired of doing all his research in his bedroom, so he's actually commissioned a section of the mountain be dug out for his own personal laboratory, as well as 2 large bookshelves that will actually help him speed up the production of his research. And then, just like that, we now have heavy bombs. Of course, though, we are all about unlocking more and more secrets of technology, so Hawthorne is going to continue his research into even larger bombs while we work on the production of the super heavy bombs. With all the production taking place here at the Mining Empire now, Hawthorne has ordered Happy Oak to go out and build a new coal-fired generator, as we're going to need more and more power, as creating these massive bombs and other weapons, as well as really just keeping the lights on around the Mining Empire, takes a lot of electricity. During this time, I also saw Scott observing the memorial that Captain Hawthorne had made for he and Beryl when he thought that they had died in the helicopter attack. It's hard to say exactly how Scott felt as he observed the memorial. It's possible it made him feel more disdain towards the Marshal Service, or maybe even empathetic to them, as it shows that they actually cared enough to make this in his honor. But in the end, only Scott will know what this memorial means to him. In the meantime, though, we begin a strip mining operation just north of the mountain, as we are in need of more and more resources. However, during this mining operation, the slaves uncovered a structure within the mountain that was previously thought to be part of the actual mountain itself. They of course quickly notified the captain, and then he showed up to investigate the structure further. It was decided by the captain and the other soldiers that they should crack open the structure and see what is inside, because surely some ancient structure in the side of a mountain in this remote area couldn't be dangerous. Could it? Well, there was only one way to find out. Our soldiers gathered around and we began chucking grenades at the wall until it exploded. We realized this section of the structure was a very small walled-off room with a door, so we forced Happy Oak to begin trying to crack open the door. While this was going on, we also noticed a stone tablet on the wall. The tablet seemed to depict a thrumbo and a strange insectoid creature possibly battling. It had many symbols as well above them. Regardless, though, we decided to enter the structure, and what we found was disgusting. Several dried up puddles of green and red blood, as well as many corpses. Many of the corpses were those insectoid creatures, however, the others were more humanoid. It would appear that these were thrumboians who had rotted in here for so long that their horns had fallen off. There were also a couple of thrumboian statues with armor that we had never seen depicted with thrumboians before. This appears to have been an ancient throne room for an ancient Thrumboian civilization from long ago. It's hard to say exactly what occurred here in the throne room, but based on our observations, it would appear that the insectoid creatures overrun the Thrumboians and killed them. Just as we were looking through the dimly lit throne room, we heard an odd vibrating-like sound in the corner. It was so dark we could hardly see, but it appeared to be a green structure of sorts. Our dog Flint and Sam Cassandra decided to take a closer look at the structure. Then, like a flash of lightning, out jumped a massive insectoid creature to attack our soldiers. We began attempting to fire at it and run away to a safer area so we could try to get out of the structure. 3 of these massive beasts knocked down Konar, trapping her inside with them. Of course, we couldn't just allow her to stay in there and bleed to death. As they feasted upon her, someone would need to go in after her. It was decided that Lieutenant Verne was the fastest, so he quickly ran in, scooped up Konar, and ran outside, slamming the doors behind him, keeping them safe from the insects. He began rushing all the way back home with Konar in his arms. Her wounds were so bad we would need the best medicine that we have to treat them. Unfortunately, as our soldiers were so focused on saving Konar, Flint ended up stuck inside the ancient structure with the insectoids, where they would beat him down and he would eventually succumb to his wounds. It took a while, but eventually we did finally make it back to the base, where we rushed Konar into one of our medical bay beds, but unfortunately we were unable to stop the bleeding in time, and Captain Hawthorne and Lieutenant Verne looked on in horror as Konar passed away. Not only has the RimWorld Marshal Service lost one of the greatest soldiers that it has ever known, but Captain Hawthorne has lost his cherished wife, and Slate has lost her lovely mother. We built Konar a slate sarcophagus and placed it in the middle of a brand new crypt that we dug within the mountain, and then we buried her. Naturally, of course, Hawthorne decided to be the one who would give the eulogy at Konar's funeral. He began talking about what a brave soldier Konar was, but not only that, Konar was a nurturing and loving mother, as well as a wonderful, loving wife to him. Just as well, of course, she served the purpose of a non-biological aunt to young Severn. She has touched the lives of so many, all lost to some insectoid beast bastards. As our soldiers performed a 21-gun salute, Hawthorne reveled in his rage and guilt. All Hawthorne had left in this world was his sister Maya and young Slate. Things had happened so fast that Hawthorne hadn't really had a moment to sit down with anyone and talk. So Lieutenant Verne decided to sit him down in the dining room that night and just kind of discuss everything. Hawthorne was completely enraged, not only against the insectoids, but also for some reason, delving into his madness more and more, he blamed the rebels for Konar's death as well. Slowly but surely, Hawthorne inches closer and closer into madness every day. Of course, something productive did come out of this conversation, though. The two of them decided that they would gather up the mining slaves, and they would go deep into the mines to look for any more ancient structures or just insectoid hives. That way we can ensure everyone is safe from them. Because, of course, if there's any more ancient structures within the mountain, surely it would be deep within the mountain, somewhere we hadn't looked so far before, possibly like the deepest parts of the mines and a little bit further beyond that. As Hawthorne and Verne were discussing their plans and ideas for this, young Slate went to visit her mother in the crypt. Unfortunately, though, visiting her mother's corpse would bring her no satisfaction, as her mother that she had loved so dearly was no longer here. There was nothing here but a body within a slate box. Slate didn't understand how this could have happened here, to them of all people. But as she was visiting her mother's grave, Hawthorne and Lieutenant Verne entered the slaves' quarters to gather up the mining slaves for a trip into the deep mines. To start with, the slaves assumed that it was possible Hawthorne and Verne knew about Captain Mitchell's body deep within the mines. However, they kind of realized that this wasn't exactly the case, as for one, they would be dead on the spot if they knew about that, and for two, they'd have no reason to bring them all the way in there if they're going to execute them. Nonetheless, though, they were steering right towards Captain Mitchell's body, and they had no way to throw Verne and Hawthorne off course so that they wouldn't find it, unfortunately, as any obstruction of the captain's orders could result in death. There was a better chance of them finding the body and fighting off Verne and the captain, or making an escape for it, than there would be to obstruct their orders. And unfortunately, this would end up being the case, as they made it to the farthest point in the mines, and it was quickly realized that there was a corpse among them. Hawthorne ordered Verne to move in and check the corpse. After realizing that it was Captain Mitchell, Larcotte quickly turned on Verne with his pickaxe. Happy Oak quickly turned on Captain Hawthorne to try and protect Larcotte, and unfortunately both of them ended up getting the absolute shit beat out of them as Frit ran away. Hawthorne and Verne carried the two slaves all the way back to the prison. As Happy Oak and Lurkot were resting in the prison cells, the captain and the lieutenant discussed their execution. Nobody told Oak and Lurkot that they were going to be executed, however they basically already knew this. Given the severity of their actions, they knew that the only punishment that they would be inflicted with would be death. But before the execution of the two slaves, there was still the matter of dealing with poor Captain Mitchell's body. It was time for us to lay his remains to rest here in the crypt. Yes, it is true that this place was never truly Captain Mitchell's home, but it's better than leaving his body in the mines to rot. Now, I know what you're probably saying as well. Why is it that only Lurkot and Happy Oak are being executed? Well, the two of them actually took full credit for the death of Captain Mitchell. Just as well, of course, Frit ran away and did not engage the captain or lieutenant, so Happy Oak and Lurkot were to blame for that as well. The two of them were brought out into the dimly lit frozen helipad and prepped for their execution for their crimes against the Marshal Service. Happy Oak even requested to be executed first because he could not bear to witness Lurkot's death, to which Hawthorne happily obliged. But then a shot rang out from across the land, Hawthorne hit the helipad, and then Lurkot and Happy Oak began running away. The soldiers rushed to pick up Hawthorne and retreat back into the base. It was Oakley who had shot Captain Hawthorne in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground and saving Happy Oak. The rebellion has arrived. Happy Oak and Lurkot began making their way towards the caves. They were going to attempt to go through the caves and try to get out of this territory before the marshals pursued them. But lucky for them, on their way through the caves, they ran into a couple of rebel soldiers who explained that they were here to liberate them. But not only did they run into rebel soldiers, they also ran into Tree and Bacchus themselves. Oak was completely flabbergasted, as well as Bacchus and Tree were extremely excited to finally see Oak. Bacchus quickly embraced Happy Oak with open arms. Welcome home, old friend. As the sun began to dawn, the rebels were pelting the mining empire with their artillery guns, shell after shell. They managed to destroy the generators, completely severing the mining empire from electricity. Naturally, the Marshal soldiers came outside to return fire against the rebels, but unfortunately for them, this would not prove to be very prosperous, as even though they fired several artillery shells at the rebels, none of them managed to get close enough to do any damage. However, on the opposite hand, the rebel artillery shells managed to hit ammunition near the artillery guns of the Marshals, destroying several of them. The Marshals' artillery guns were destroyed, as was their power supply, and their runway was damaged, preventing their plane from taking off. It was during this epic battle between the Marshals and the rebels that Happy Oak and Lurkot removed their slave collars. After years of enslavement, they were finally free once more. Not only were they free, but they were free to choose, and they chose to stand beside the rebels. And it was during this time as well that Oakley, Bacchus, and Tree were all going over their battle plans. So far, everything was going according to plan, but now with the arrival of the rebel forces, it was finally time for Scott to uphold his end of the plans. He quickly entered the slave quarters where he would rally all three of the remaining slaves against the Marshals. The four of them rushed through the hallways of the mining empire where they would encounter Lieutenant Vern. They began beating the absolute daylights out of him. After taking Vern to the ground, Frit grabbed his rifle, pointed it at him, and then executed him right there in the hallway in front of everyone. As they all screamed down with the Marshals running through the hallways looking for Hawthorne and the others to kill, they encountered them at the end of the hall and a shootout began between the soldiers and the rebels. Neither side, of course, giving a single inch to the other. The Marshal soldiers, of course, were too damn prideful to lose to slaves and rebels, and the slaves would not give up their freedom so easily. It was finally time for revolution and liberation. Upon stepping outside to look for an escape route, Hawthorne saw a massive group of rebels amassed by the flagpole, but not only that, they had his sister with them. They allowed Hawthorne and his sister Maya to approach one another so that Maya could explain what the rebels were offering to him. But of course, Maya quickly urged him to listen to the rebels' demands so that the two of them could still be together and neither of them would die. Shockingly, Tree offered to accept Hawthorne's surrender if he were to surrender himself, the other soldiers, as well as the remaining slaves, and come and do research for the rebels. With his sister's recommendation, Hawthorne actually accepted this gracious offer. Maya and Slate were the only family Hawthorne had left. If he were to die, Slate would be alone, as would Maya, or if he were to turn against the rebels' orders, it is very possible that they may all die. He and Maya looked all around the base for Scott and the slaves to explain to them that they were finally surrendering and they were going to be given their freedom. This was Hawthorne's last-ditch effort to try and preserve himself and his family, which is ever so ironic, and this was not lost on Scott and the slaves, as he had taken the lives and families from so many others. No. Scott and the others did not believe that Hawthorne deserved to be allowed to surrender, so they decided to take matters into their own hands. Frit quickly raised her rifle and shot Hawthorne to the ground. After Hawthorne hit the ground, Scott quickly raised his pistol and shot Hawthorne's sister in the head, killing her. With all the atrocities that Hawthorne has committed, he does not deserve a free pass in exchange for some research. As the others left and Hawthorne lie there on the ground next to his dead sister in a puddle of his own blood, Beyonder creeped up on him. Hawthorne begged Beyonder for mercy, but Beyonder said there was no mercy for no pricks, as he threw a Molotov cocktail at the massive bombs that Hawthorne had created. And now we would truly see the power of these super heavy bombs that Hawthorne had researched. After the massive, catastrophic explosion, the rebel soldiers would begin infiltrating the mining empire, and the remaining Marshal soldiers like Sev, Sandra, and Norman would all be arrested and taken into custody by the rebels. Since Scott lied and said that Hawthorne had turned on them within the mining empire base, a fair trial was now no longer on the table for any of the Marshal soldiers. Since Scott, of course, did hold up his end of the bargain though, Tree, Bacchus, and Shortus granted him a pardon. He would now be free to continue his life. However, he was no longer allowed to serve in the rebel forces. Even though he had somewhat redeemed himself, there's no room for traitors among our ranks. Tree, of course, said that it was a complete shame that Hawthorne had betrayed them like this, as his research into weapons and whatnot would have proved crucial for defeating the Marshal service. But of course, we will continue winning this war one Marshal base at a time. After their incredible victory here today, with the fall of the mining empire, everyone was so eager to get back home. Yes, of course, in terms of the war and liberating the planet, there was still so much to do, but the tyrant known as Hawthorne had finally been toppled. And that, my friends, was worth celebrating. But guys, I want to thank you all ever so much for watching the episode as well as just the entire series and staying with me in our Rat Knight RimWorld universe. This is so much fun and we have plenty more to come. I hope you continue watching and sharing this story with me, this shared universe and just our adventures, you know. But I love you guys ever so much. I hope you all have a wonderful day and I will see you in the next series. Goodbye.